As we gather here today in one of the central heart places of Portland State University, this ballroom, so many events and so many things have transpired here. It's a place we come together. I want to start with an important land acknowledgement. And really, every time we do this, I want to make sure we listen and think and reflect, not just think it's a part of the thing we need to get through. So I'm going to read it, but I hope we all take a moment to actually reflect and think about it. Portland State University is located in the heart of downtown Portland, Oregon, in Multnomah County. Today, we honor the indigenous people whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand on, the Multnomah, Calumet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala, bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kaiapua, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It's important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and to recognize that they were here, that we are here because of sacrifices forced upon them. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. Thank you. Well, I'm so excited to be here this morning, and I want to start out with a shout out to Vanelda for that great breakfast. Some of you know I've been a big fan of the big breakfast. You get people here early, you get them here to work, you work hard, you want to feed them. So we get orange juice, that's a rarity, bacon, pancakes, tofu, everything. So thank you, Vanelda, for thinking of us and taking care of us. I really appreciate that. I want to say that I'm so delighted to sort of open this discussion and continuing exploration of Students First. Our new name, we're always going to call it Students First, so I'm sure you've heard that already, Students First. Our comprehensive, holistic, ever-growing, and long-term commitment to advancing the success of our students. I'm here to support, I'm here to recognize, I'm here to applaud, I'm here to strengthen, and I'm here to champion this with all of you. So know that the interim president is here with you on this. And I just wanted to say that this conversation is so aligned in so many ways, in so many places. It's so aligned with our mission starting with Vanport was to help people who were coming back from World War II, so veterans, to find education in a place near their home. We've gravitated into this wonderful, rich urban research university, but at the heart of that has always been a commitment to student learning and student success, and that our arms have been wide open to different types of students from different backgrounds, hoping we can support every single one of them to success. This is so aligned with national conversations. If you're reading the Chronicle of Higher Ed, you're reading other higher education magazines and things, this is a very interesting conversation that's going on. And I think as a society, we're realizing that sometimes educational achievement is much higher among people who enter it with privilege than those who do not. And so part of what we're trying to do in higher ed is find ways to better support students from all types of backgrounds to be successful. And it is a national conversation about that. And so we're very relevant as we're doing that here. It's also extremely relevant for the state legislature, which we've had many conversations with them. There are lots of issues swirling around higher education and the funding of higher education and the understanding by the legislature of higher education. But one thing state legislators are very focused on is student achievement, and they recognize that some of our students may need extra support or may need some financial assistance more than they have, other kinds of supports and activities and maybe new pedagogies that support it. So they're actually very supportive of the idea of this, and the idea of student outcomes being measured on that, which we increasingly are. The kind of work we're doing feeds right into that. And it also is so aligned with the passions and interests of our provost and the Office of Academic Affairs, who are all behind it, supportive, enthusiastic. Get it going, let's get excited, and let's make some change. So thanks for everybody there. I'm also so excited that so many of you have become involved in different places. There are teams and groups, and I can't even name them all, and I'm excited about that. I'm excited that we are engaging in different areas. There's all kinds of different areas in student services, student life, academic world, teaching programs, pedagogy, so many ways that all of that can come together to support student success. I always have to say we've always been about student success, but now we're trying to even be more triple down and using data in new ways and other strategies to move forward. And my final comment is, I hope one thing that this does is lets us to create questioning minds. so that all of us can think, and we live in this wonderful world, and sometimes you're going to see something, hear something, or get something in your class grades or your class feedback or something that makes you think, gee, maybe there's something here we could do, we could respond to. So part of it is just being creative, watching what's happening, seeing what's going on, and being creative, and we certainly welcome that creativity, whether that involves more data to understand the problem more fully, whether it needs some pilots to try something new or some strategies. I hope we'll all be open-minded about ways that we just be alert to ways and new things we can do. So I don't want to spend any more time. I want to welcome you here. We have a great speaker. Omid Fatoui is here. I've had lovely dinner with him last night. He's a very exciting person. You're going to have a great day. So have a great day and keep up the enthusiasm and go students first. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Steve. I can't tell you how much it means every time you show your support and your leadership for this work. It's really powerful to have your strong voice and your commitment to this project. I'm really happy to be here to celebrate the second Winter Symposium since I've been provost at PSU, as we continue our conversations on moving and advancing our work and our commitment to student success. The breakfast is great. I understand from Gwen Schusterman that she's the cause, actually, of the bacon. So if you're a bacon fan, you can thank Gwen. She said she wouldn't come for breakfast if there wasn't bacon. And I just try to keep Gwen happy. I think that's an all-around good strategy. But I do want to acknowledge and thank Vanelda Hopes, who coordinated and organized this entire event, as she does everything in our office in academic affairs, and I'm very grateful for the effectiveness and efficiency she brings and the grace to all of this work. So thank you again, Vanelda. So as Steve shared, we have now given a name to this phase of our student success work, Students First. And you have on your tables some of the first, actually you all are the first folks to see the branding for this work. We've decided to make sure that there is a look and a recognition to the Students First project, and you'll be able to see this and recognize it as we go forward. This slide here is showing you some of that look and how we're going to be talking about Students First. The important thing here, and I don't want to dwell too long on this, but I do want to remind all of you that we have divided this work into 4 key pillars. The single most important thing, of course, is that the entirety of this work belongs to the entirety of the campus. There is not a single person at PSU who does not play a role in the success of our students. And so this is a campus-wide work. It's, though academic affairs is providing some leadership for this, it is not our work. It is the work of the entire institution. And that means everyone has a role to play and a way to ask themselves, what are my responsibilities on behalf of our students? We have divided this work into what we perceive at this time to be 4 key themes. The first of those being persistence. That is the individual question for each student about how we can support them in overcoming barriers to persist, stay, and complete their degrees. This work is a case management strategy where there is an active team of folks who is focusing on addressing individual student persistence needs, as well as identifying on behalf of the institution consistent barriers that are facing large numbers of students that we can then begin to address. The second of these areas is academic success, the core of the activities our students have here. What's happening in the classroom, what's happening in their degree programs, what's happening in their curricular pathways, in advising. All of these things together are the core questions and responsibilities we have on behalf of our students. And this committee is looking at these larger issues that students are facing in their academic success. Of course, one of the key issues that many of our students remind us is pivotal for them is this issue of affordability. How can they in its entirety afford their education? This committee is working on more than tuition cost, because affordability is more than tuition. It is the ability to have transportation support, housing support, food security, textbooks, all of the things that are pivotal to a student's ability to succeed. So this committee is looking in its entirety at this question of how we can, as an institution, enable our students to have affordability for their degree programs and other educational pursuits that they have. The final piece is the student experience. I think we all understand that there is a lot that happens in partnership with the classroom and outside the classroom that impacts our students' ability to succeed and persist. So what is that experience? How does the campus feel to our students? Do they feel that they belong? Do they feel that they are recognized here? Do they feel that their identity is respected by Portland State University? The work that we're going to do in this committee will be really powerful in learning more about how our students feel about their experiences and how we can support those experiences to be as successful as possible. Because of course, all of these pillars, though we are dividing the work so that it can have focus and intentionality, are intersecting with each other. What happens in the experience outside the classroom, impacts persistence, and so on. Underneath all of this work is a foundation in data and analysis. We want to have hard research that undergirds what we're doing here. I think a lot of us have individual experiences with students where we can say, somebody said this to me and I heard this. That's a good beginning point. It might help us ask analytical questions, but we need to have a grounding in data. So there's an entire team that is dedicated to being able to answer those data questions, provide us the tools we need to analyze the proposed ideas we have to address students' issues, and then assess whether they've been effective or not. So this is our Students First work. Everybody in here is going to be involved in this if you haven't already. I think most of the co-chairs for these committees are here. I hope you'll have a chance to talk to them and participate in this work. And in advance, I thank you for everything that you're doing on behalf of our students and Students First. I was asked this morning by the PSU Foundation to share another nice piece of news on behalf of our students. We have just decided, and I think Steve picked the name yesterday. We have a fabulous gift from Christine and David Vernier, who are the founders of Vernier Software and Technology, and they are longtime PSU supporters. They have made a substantial pledge to help with the renovation of Science Building 1. Yes, exactly. This renovation will give us flexible classrooms, state-of-the-art laboratories, collaborative research and training spaces, exactly the kind of learning spaces that we know contribute to student success. So it's a very, very powerful gift that they've made, because it not only gives us a chance to solidify the vision for that building, but it gives us a chance to go to the legislature with that support and secure the funds that we need to finalize that building and begin the remodel. And it will become a hub for thinking about how student success is embedded in our buildings and in our classrooms and in the ways in which we construct spaces for students. The other thing that this remodeled building will do is that we'll have a chance not only to have new classrooms and spaces, but it will co-locate Portland State's numerous programs that are supporting first generation and historically underrepresented students in STEM. So that work will be housed in this building in a collective and collaborative way. The Verniers, of course, have been longstanding supporters of PSU. Christine Vernier is a trustee. And in recognition of that, the building is going to be called the Vernier Science Center. So we can look forward to having that building open. So why pick the topic of mindset for today's symposium? As I was going through my first year here and listening to folks talk, it came up as something that so many of you talked about. Student mindset, student sense of belonging. And so it's work that obviously is already happening. It's a conversation that is already taking place at Portland State, and many of you are already actively engaged in this work. And of course, the core of this, while the research around mindset is broad, and we'll hear a lot of that about that today, but the core of this is the distinction between a fixed and a growth mindset. Do our students believe, and do we believe about them, that intelligence is static, and that whatever you know now is pretty much the capacity of how you're going to do it? Or that intelligence can be developed? And obviously, growth mindset is something that is imperative to success for students. The ability to persist in the face of setbacks, to find inspiration in others and the success of others, to learn from criticism and take feedback, and to see effort as a path to mastery. That is the growth mindset. And we want to make sure that we are enacting our responsibility as an institution. Obviously, our students take some ownership and responsibility for that, but as an institution, we have responsibilities as well. How are we creating cultures? How are we creating messages? And how are we ensuring that in direct and maybe indirect ways, we are communicating to students that we are foundationally committed to a growth mindset and not to a fixed mindset. And some of that requires a lot of self-reflection on our own part. The comments that we make as we give a student feedback on an essay, we may think are good, strong comments and are interpreted by a student as, oh, she doesn't think I can do it. She doesn't think I can get better. We may be unaware that that's what we're doing. We may be unaware as we present orientation programs, how we're telling students about their upcoming and future experiences. So we need to look hard at ourselves. The good news is there is a ton of national research on this and lots of best practices from other institutions from whom we can learn. So we have the commitment to this. I think we want to just secure that we have the research foundation and the assessment capabilities to ensure that we are enacting the outcomes of that research. So the goals we have for today are to update ourselves on some of that national research on mindset through our guest speaker, to explore further how this research can benefit our students. We also want to highlight some of the ongoing work that is happening here at PSU, and we want to discuss the application and implementation of what we learned today. So to introduce our speaker, we have the co-chairs of our Academic Success Committee, Matt Carlson and Yves Labussière, who I think are going to introduce our speaker.
Morning. Before I say anything, I want to make sure and give a shout out to Andrea Garrity, who's worked tirelessly to move a lot of this work forward, without whom a lot of the work wouldn't have happened. And frankly, I feel fairly certain that she's learned how to be in two places at once. I don't know how she does it, but. It's really nice to see so many people here. This has always been one of my favorite events because it's one of the few chances we actually take to take a little break from our very busy lives and spend even a few minutes talking with each other about things that are important to us. And we have a crowded room today and around student success, and it's really great to see everybody here. So Eve and I are the co-chairs of the Academic Success Pillar, and I just want to we're going to give a very brief update on sort of where we're at with that. And the first thing I want to mention is a couple of things. You know, as we began this work a few months ago, we recognized that we really need to think carefully about how we define and think about and talk about and describe what academic student success means to us. And really, there's a couple of things you'll see in the definition, which I don't have in front of me. I can't read it, and I don't want to. But the two things is we're centering equity in this work. It's not enough to just improve success, but we need to think carefully about for whom are we improving success, and disaggregate data, for example, and look carefully at how all of our students are experiencing their classrooms. So that's a very important part of our definition and what we're doing. I think another thing that we recognized very early on is how many of you are already doing the hard work of trying to improve the academic success of students. I know 2 years ago, the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Karen Marangel, asked all 24 department chairs to think about how their students are experiencing their classrooms, what are the kinds of things that might be impeding their success, and maybe think about ways to improve it. And I know over the last 2 years, many departments have been working at this. So for us, it's to create a new effort around academic success is a bit of a misnomer, because the reality is we're doing it all across campus already. And so we're really going to begin our efforts by taking a very careful and comprehensive census as much as we can of the work that's already happening, and think about and identify all the projects that are going on around campus. So we're very excited about that. And of course, we'll be reaching out to many of you in this room over the next few weeks as we begin to do that work.
So as Matt mentioned, we see that we have a very different kind of opportunity here, because so much good work has been happening around campus. So we're approaching this as, this is an opportunity for us to connect conversations, to connect good work that's been happening, and it's an opportunity to connect, to understand, and to deepen our practice. And I think that's the goal. One of the charges that our committee was tasked with is to understand all of the data that we've been collecting on DWF rates, which is drops, failures, and withdrawal rates. But we saw this as a framing that may be a little bit too confining for the committee. So we thought, how can we use DWF as a way to begin to change the conversation around student success? So how can DWF improve how we think about equity? How can DWF improve our understanding of what happens to students when they first encounter lack of success, when they first encounter failure? And how can we use that to really, so that the data that we've been collecting is not used as a weapon, either as a weapon for the faculty or for the students. So it's not about pointing out what faculty are not doing right. It's not about pointing out where students are struggling. It's about how do we use the data to inform our understanding of where are the places where our students struggle. So as we do this work, we would like it to be asset-based. As we do this work, we don't want to undermine the growth mindset conversations that we want to instill on our campus. So we're just going to put that out as the ethos with which we are taking on this the student success work.
So we look forward to spending some time together to talk about the topics for today's work around the psychology of motivation, growth mindset, and inclusive pedagogy, thanks to Aaron Shortledge from Department of Biology in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. So I'd like to begin by now introducing Dr. Ahmed Fatoui, who's a motivation and performance researcher and a nationally recognized speaker who has more than 15 years of experience training students, athletes, and leaders to optimize their performance. He earned his PhD in psychology from the University of Waterloo and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford University, and currently holds an affiliation with the University of Pittsburgh. While at Stanford, he co-founded the College Transitions Collaborative, one of the largest multi-institution collaborations to deliver proven psychological interventions to over 40,000 students, and the Stanford Interventions Lab, a collaborative research group committed to sharing and scaling proven insights from psychology to promote better performance and well-being. Dr. Fatoui has devoted his career to translating key insights from research on performance optimization into actionable strategies that help to improve critical outcomes in the domains of academics, athletics, leadership, and personal growth. Without further ado, Dr. Fatoui. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you. Good morning. I hope everyone can hear me. It turns out that as a speaker, I actually have a relatively weak voice, so somehow I've made it work. I do want to start off by thanking all of you for being here, for showing up. In my work, in my life, I have the unusual sort of privilege of basically just chatting and talking to people. And so I get paid, I get sort of evaluated on how well I'm able to speak and listen to people. And that's essentially what I do for a living. I travel, I go to institutions like this. Here's some feedback here. Let me see if we can cut that up. Is that better? Yeah. I have conversations with people like you, who on a day-to-day basis are doing the work that we all theorize about, that we all think about and draft up journal articles about and come up with theories around what makes effective pedagogy and what translates into student success. But it's really about, if I had to sort of pare it down to a single outcome, it's about showing up, right? So we, in my field, in my particular niche, look at the factors that determine whether people show up or don't. And essentially, that's what you all have done here today, is you all have shown up, just like you show up every day for your students. You show up both in mind and in body. And what we'll talk about today is how do you show up in a way that allows your students to also feel like they can show up on a day-to-day basis, both in mind and body. Because as you know, doing the work that you do, which I will take the opportunity here to say that it's probably one of the most difficult things and professions that anyone's ever thought about. It's one of those things where on a day-to-day basis, you're putting out your heart and soul without ever getting any promise of validation or reinforcement for what you're doing. So if you do your job well, in the best case scenario, your students will then go on and have a great life and career, but you'll never know about it. And so here you are asked on a day-to-day basis to keep doing what you do without any validation of the effectiveness of what you're doing. So I just want to sort of thank you for the work that you're doing, because you are creating our society in a way that can't be fully understood. With a show of hands, can I just get a sense of who's in the room? How many people here are faculty? How many people here are administrators? How many people here are advisors? And how many people here are learners? Great. What I've demonstrated here, I hope, is that we in the same room can occupy multiple identities. And when we think about learning, one of the things that I'll argue for is that learning is not this process where students are expected to take content and simply absorb it. That learning actually is a social experience. When you look at the way that children are born, they're born as avid, hungry, resilient learners. That is, a child who is learning how to walk won't try it for a little while, and as they fail, say, oh, well, I guess I'm not going to be a walker. They persist. And what's also interesting about that whole experience is that it's not something that always lasts, right? That as students go on to an academic path, that at certain points we might find that students feel disengaged, unmotivated, feel like this is not really a place for them. And the question is why? Now, going back to the example of a walker, I'm going to argue that part of the reason why we never gave up walking might be because of the belief that our parents had. For parents, we don't see our child's failures as something that's contingent on whether they'll be a walker or not. We just know that they'll be a walker. There is no alternative in terms of what the outcome is. And so it could be that we all become walkers because our parents didn't see an alternative to our outcomes. And I wonder if that's something that we can tap into as well as we think about how we engage our students. How is it that we, as teachers, and through our beliefs, act as the gatekeepers of the identities that our students internalize? Because ultimately, you become someone who sees yourself as a learner or not. And along the long journey that we all take, there are moments where people ask themselves, is this something that I can internalize? Am I a learner? As Steve mentioned today it's about thinking about the questions. And what I'll be talking about today really centers around the questions that people ask and the value of focusing on those moments where people ask questions. Because that's both where potential harm occurs, but it's also where we can intervene and create a moment where students can gain access to those identities that we want them to have. In my work, traveling and working with students and faculty, sometimes I'll have conversations with students. And one of the conversations that I had not too long ago was of a young lady who came up to me after the presentation and said, I really appreciated what you said. It resonated with me. And she said, although I really appreciate some of these issues that hold people up, that prevents them from showing up, I still haven't figured out how to create social friends or social networks. And I asked, well, what is your typical day like? And being an older student who also has to work, she said, well, I typically, in between work shifts, if I have a class, I'll drive up to the campus, and I'll have my lunch with me, and I'll eat my lunch, and I'll walk, and I'll sit in the car, and I'll watch these people walking around, seamlessly making friends and walking around socializing. And I wonder how they do it. And I thought, isn't that interesting that you are in this sort of car that is the physical representation of your mental block, that somehow you see that those individuals are different than you are, and that core belief is exactly what is preventing you from going out and doing what allows you to create friends. And as we talk about student success, it's a lot of thinking about what are the factors that hold students back. What are the barriers that causes them to make attributions or come up with answers to questions around why this is not a place that's for me or why I can't do it here. And so let's dive in. Before we dive in too deeply, a question that I think is worth wondering about is college worth it, right? If you ask someone who's just graduated high school, they're at the prime of their lives. They could be traveling across Europe. They could be backpacking. They could start a family. They could start a business. And yet they're asked to forego that and instead be placed in a classroom where they're talked at. They're given their schedule that they have to comply with. And they're constantly told the so many ways in which they're the wrong, over and over and over again for a number of years, without any guarantee that they'll actually be able to get through it. And so the question is, why is college worth it? Well, I can't speak to all of the factors, but I can speak to at least what the data shows in terms of the financial rewards, that education continues to be one of the surest paths towards a secure income, that if you want to be able to provide for you and your family, that education is one of the channels of upward mobility that continues to be one of the best paths moving forward. And it's not just that it provides greater access to financial means. There's evidence also showing that people who have a quality education also have a greater likelihood of having a greater sense of satisfaction and work satisfaction once they graduate college. So the Gallup report is a large-scale survey of students, and they asked students, what are the experiences that you have during college? And they found that the kind of engagement, the showing up that we talked about, are the factors that predict how happy you are in life and how satisfied you are with your work. And those included things like having greater academic engagement, so talking to your professors, being part of research, but also social engagements, being part of clubs and having social networks that matter. Despite these clear advantages, we all know in this room that there is historically consistent and chronic achievement gaps, that despite the same benefits, that there are groups that consistently underperform relative to others across the ages and across the times, that these persist in ways that we haven't been able to fully tackle yet. And so the question might be, why is this happening? Some might be tempted to say, well, maybe at the very competitive levels, there might be a genetic component, that some people are just sort of born with the quality that allows them to persist and perform at the very elite levels, while others, unfortunately, don't have that gene. And that's certainly a perception or an attribution or an explanation that's out there. Not too long ago, we've seen some prominent individuals publicly disclose these ideas. But fortunately for me, which is that the folks that I work with have basically invested their lives in questioning these assumptions that we have, and trying to use a data-informed approach to come up with the conclusions that we sometimes take for granted. So in some of the early pioneer work, where they were trying to figure out really what is the cause of individuals from different groups performing at different levels. And so to test this, they said, well, why don't we invite men and women into the lab and tell them that we're going to give them a math test to see if these individuals who, before they were selected to come into the class, into the test laboratory, had the same exact grades. So on paper, they were identical. And they both expressed a similar level of interest in mathematics. And then they brought them into the lab, and they said, let's see if we can sort of play around with the contextual or conditions to see if we can get at some of these performance issues that we've noticed. And so in one condition, what they said is that you're about to do a relatively hard part of the math GREs, and this is basically the kind of test that you would typically do. And that's kind of the implicit instructions that we give all of our students when they're about to do a math test or any kind of difficult test. In the other condition, they said, we're going to give you a math test, and although we know that typically there are gender differences on some of these standardized tests, guess what? This particular test that we've devised doesn't show any gender differences. And what they found was that simply sort of reducing the anxiety around, will I perform at a different way, it achieved exactly the outcome that they forecast with the condition instructions, that women who were told that this test does not show differential effects for men and women actually performed at the same level, if not better than the men. And yet the ones who were given the same standard instructions that we all sort of give when we give tests demonstrated this underperformance. Now, I want to be explicit around underperformance, because that's really at the core of what we focus on. So it's not that certain people perform at different levels. It's that based on their credentials, their grades, that people come into a new context and they perform less well than you might expect them to. And the question is why, and how can we mitigate that? This work, obviously, by Claude Steele, led to the formation of the stereotype threat phenomenon that we have all heard about. And essentially, a stereotype threat is when a person perceives a negative stereotype about them or their group. And the mere wondering of, will I be negatively evaluated? Am I negatively viewed in this context? Becomes the cause of the underperformance. And I want to be clear that, again, when we talk about identities, that we all occupy multiple social identities. Right now, I'm a speaker. When I go home, I'm a father. When I put on my running shoes, I'm a runner. And any time, any one of these identities, in my mind, is negatively viewed or questioned, I might now activate the kind of busy mind work that comes and takes away from my cognitive resources to do the work that I need to be doing in that moment. So anytime there's this chatter behind the scenes around, am I being negatively viewed, that takes the task that you should be focusing on and includes a distraction that undermines your performance. And this anxiety, exactly because of the experience of depletion of working memory, of the increased stress and the increased vigilance around how you're being viewed and perceived, prevents an individual from being able to focus on the test that's in front of them, and instead is combating all these thoughts in the back of their minds. And that becomes a cause of the underperformance, and there's now thousands of studies demonstrating that this is exactly what's happening. Now, I also just want to take another big step back. If you'll bear with me, I want to question something that we all sort of might take for granted as being universal, reality. Now, as a psychologist, we tend to have a slightly different view of reality, that it's not this objective thing that we all interact with, that we're all sort of touching and playing with and talking about in the same way, that reality instead is subjective, because of a number of core factors. That reality is subjective, that it is biased to a large extent, and that it's prone to influences outside of our control. So if you portray reality in this way, it's really not this objective thing. It's actually this pretty fallible thing. To demonstrate, let me get you to focus on the letter in the middle. Now, as you look at this, you might see the letter H in the middle, but put in a different context, all of a sudden that same image becomes the letter A. Another example, the letter in the middle, although it seems like the letter B, turns into the number 13 based on the context. Now, we all make these sort of mental inferences based on incomplete information in a split second. Now, you might take it for granted that, of course, I'm going to make these judgments. My brain is there to help me understand reality. But if you recognize that there's some level of subjectivity, that there's some level of questioning and flexibility around what the same event means, you also recognize that that's exactly where there's opportunity for negative thoughts or negative attributions for certain groups in certain contexts at certain times to seep in and have a harmful effect. Let me ask another question. So with a show of hands, how many people see a bird here? With another show of hands, how many people see a rabbit here? Same image, same group, but different perceptions. Now, it also turns out that context matters. So when they've done studies and they've shown this image around Easter Sunday, most people saw the rabbit, and when they show it around closer to Thanksgiving, most people see the bird. I will say, the only time I've ever seen this fail is another time when I presented in Eugene, and in Oregon, people are more likely to see the duck than they are the rabbit. So I'm actually surprised that some people didn't see the duck today. Here's another example, and if I told you that one of these circles is bigger than the other, and quickly you've got to gauge which one it is. With a show of hands, who would say the gray circle is bigger? Now, who would say the brown circle is bigger? Turns out they're identical. Now, with the mere suggestion that one circle might be bigger than the other, I was able to get you to question your own senses in terms of what is reality. And if there's this level of influence that's available, the question is how much does this impact individuals as they navigate the social ambiguities of making sense of negative feedback, of social interactions, of talking to professors on a day-to-day basis in a way that accumulates over time. And at the end of the day, how does that turn into the kind of identity that students are able to embody and accept as their own versus not? And that's at the core of what we talk about and what we focus on when we talk about mindset or belonging. It's how is it that people answer these questions in a moment-by-moment basis that adds up to how we see ourselves in our social worlds. My hope is that at the end of this presentation, you'll leave with more of an acute perception around the ambiguities that are all around us so that you can be attuned to the moments when you can intervene and sort of quell the anxieties or the negative attributions that people make that might lead them to fall astray from the identity that we want them to have. And it turns out that in college, there are basically 3 common questions that students ask themselves. And the questions are, do I belong when I feel lonely or disrespected? Does it mean that I don't belong? When things get hard, does it mean that I can't do it? And when it's boring, does it mean that there's no reason to try? So again, these are the common questions that students ask, and depending on how you answer that question, you can have a very different outcome. And that's because we all sort of, as I mentioned, navigate our lives with this sort of little narrator on our shoulder that helps us make meaning of what's happening. If you get a student who gets a D, and Jane, for instance, gets a D, and in her mind she says, well, I must not have studied for the right sections. I'm going to talk to my teacher to find out how I can study better for the next test. Now, you get the same D, and Joe, the other student, instead makes this attribution. This is clearly evidence that confirming that I'm not smart enough and that I don't belong in college. I'm probably an admissions error, and I should just drop out because I can't handle it here. Again, the same event, the same sort of stimulus, but interpreted in different ways. And as you can imagine, Jane and Joe are going to respond in very different ways. With Jane, she might say, well, because I didn't study the right sections and maybe I should talk to my teacher, she'll be more likely to actually engage with her teacher or study with her peers so that she can do better on the next test. Now, Joe, on the other hand, if he feels like this is evidence that he's not smart enough, feels ashamed by this D, instead is less likely to talk to a teacher, less likely to work with peers, and in turn is more likely to do more poorly on the next test. Now, what happens now? Their initial concerns are confirmed, that I'm not smart enough, and I now have 2 points of data to confirm exactly that. And this is what we call these sort of recursive processes that again shows the harmful effects of the accumulating effects of these questions being answered in negative ways. And so in the face of challenge and difficulty, you might get people making negative attributions like it's just me or people like me that are struggling, that I don't belong, that I'm not smart enough, that there's no point. And that leads to experiences of shame, isolation, and disengagement. And as we've mentioned, if you're part of a certain group, of a negatively stereotyped group, who absent any other clear explanation for why you're feeling uncertain, why you're feeling anxiety, why you feel like you're struggling, might be more prone to accept the commonly held stereotypes about you or your group. And that's exactly that moment of flexibility. If you're part of this group and you don't have any other clear explanation for why you got that D and why you feel anxious and why you feel like you're the only one, you might be a little bit more likely to make these negative attributions compared to someone who doesn't have to contend with these negative stereotypes. And that's exactly the sweet spot of both where things can go wrong, but also where we can potentially intervene. The other component of this, which I think is useful to think about, is what Stanford likes to call the duck syndrome, but maybe you all have more rights to it, which is this duck syndrome that represents how students see themselves and other students on campus. They walk on campus and they see all these other ducks seamlessly gliding across the surface of the water. But what they don't see for other students that they see for themselves is that they are paddling furiously under the water to stay afloat. Now, why is this relevant? Well, if you feel like you are the only one struggling, what are you not going to do? You're not going to speak up about it. You're not going to ask someone for help because you feel like you are somehow different. And this pluralistic ignorance, this notion that you are somehow unique and your challenges are unique, causes people to, again, sort of isolate themselves and disengage as a result of the shame that they feel. As I've mentioned, I don't want to be too gloomy, but the ambiguities that students encounter on a day-to-day basis are both the moments when they might fall into these moments of prey to their negative attributions, but it's also moments where we as psychologists become very excited about, because that's exactly where we can intervene. So let's talk about some of the ways that intervention is possible. I'll say broadly that in the 10 years that I've been in this space and thinking about student success and intervention approaches, there are three main approaches that tend to work really well. One has to do with changing the subjective lens that students navigate their worlds. As I mentioned, there's a subjectivity that students have that allows us to come up with interventions that gives them the more adaptive attribution patterns that helps them stay engaged. That's great. The other is not just assume that the students have these maladaptive lenses, but to recognize that there are cues in the context, that these objective messages that for a student who might be questioning whether they do belong, whether they can do it, conveys to them something very different than what other students might feel. If you're a female in a math class or an engineering program, where the engineering program was sort of an afterthought or came later as part of the school's history, and you find yourself wanting to go to the bathroom after your teacher gives you a bad remark on a question that you had, where you are one of maybe 5 females in a class of 60 males, and as you're walking to the bathroom that's located in this distant dark hallway because it was placed there later, and on the hallway you see picture of old white guy, and you wonder, what do these cues mean? What does it mean about me and people like me in terms of whether I belong here? Can I do it? Especially in the face of negative feedback or challenge. And again, I want to emphasize that because when things are going well, you're not going to be paying attention to these pictures. You're just going to go to the bathroom. But if you just got a pretty bad comment publicly in the class where you feel like you sort of are seen in a positive light, and you want to go to the bathroom in a moment of escape, but there is no escape to the cues around you that suggest that this is not a place for you. Because of that subjectivity and that moment of vulnerability, these attributions are more likely. And finally, and I don't often include this in the presentation, but I will when I feel like a campus is ready for it. The third approach is changing the culture. And that is a little bit more of an ambitious goal to have, but if you're ready, then it is an essential part to creating the student success that we all look for. So let me go through some of these and see how we can address each one. The first category that I mentioned is changing the subjective lenses that students have. In general, what these interventions do is they hope to sort of provide students with slightly more adaptive or positive attributions to moments of ambiguity. And as I mentioned, it's not any single event that is the determinant of how well students do. Instead, it's changing the lens so that you're able to set off a recursive process. So if you feel like that intelligence, for instance, is this innate talent that some people have more or less of, and you find yourself struggling, then every instance of struggle will sort of be attributed in the same way, that clearly I'm not smart enough, so why bother? But what if you're able to question the perceptions that students have about their intelligence? What if you're able to inject in their minds for a moment that possibly struggle means that you're learning and growing? Maybe the next time they have a difficult experience, they're able to persist a little bit more, which in turn leads to better responses and better outcomes, which in turn feeds that more adaptive attribution. So these psychological interventions rely on recursive processes, and they're very distinct. Let me be clear about this as well, is that they're very distinct from the more traditional information-based or behavioral tactics-based kinds of approaches. So if you tell someone there's a lot of benefits to exercising, so you should exercise, that's one approach. Or here's what you need to do tomorrow morning, I want you to go and do a workout. That's informational-based and behavioral-based. Those are very specific, but they're linked to a singular moment. And so you have to continue to reinforce those strategies on an ongoing basis for them to be effective. Instead, what these interventions do is they change the lens so that you can initiate a recursive process, so that people start seeing their worlds in a different way. And that is the basis and the key of why these things work as well as they do. And we'll talk about some examples. And part of that has to do with, again, thinking about questions. The questions that our students ask. And seeing if we can shift those questions from questions of, can I? So, am I smart enough or not? Does this mean I don't belong? Can I trust that I'll be supported? Where the answer is yes or no, to how can I? And where the questions now become, how can I become smarter? How do I develop my belonging? And how can I find the support that I need? Notice, very similar question, but the agency is taken back. Now, instead of wondering, can my context tell me something about me? The question is, how do I learn more about myself and gain more insight and grow and become stronger by taking advantage of my context? And this subtle shift is incredibly powerful because a lot of these interventions, what they do is they don't change the structural resources. There'll still be the same amount of tutoring, there'll still be the same amount of advising, but what changes is the likelihood that students are going to take advantage of those resources. So the first example has to do with belonging. And so many schools now are recognizing that students, as they transition into college, come with this question of, is this the place for me? Do I belong? And this turns out to be something that causes them to be vigilant for moments of ambiguity. So if they have an ambivalent interaction with their professor, who, based on their high school experiences, they had very warm, supportive conversations with their teachers because of the smaller classroom. Now they're in large lecture rooms, and the teachers have a larger student load. And so the teacher may not have as much time for that student. But from the student's perspective, they find the teacher to be a little bit colder, a little bit less supportive, and they wonder, what does that mean? And it's that uncertainty about whether I belong that helps them make inferences around these ambiguities that impacts them. What these interventions do is essentially try to do two things. One is they try to create a sense that your challenges, your uncertainties, your difficulties are normal. Now, let me also take a moment to clearly define what normal means. Now, some schools that we've worked with or have heard about will, for instance, have a welcome video where they show students who are upperclassmen talk about the campus climate, and they'll say, welcome to so-and-so school. You'll find that once you get started, you'll have to sort of pick up the pace pretty quickly because there's a lot of things that you can get involved with. And it turns out that there's some competition among your peers, and if you don't sort of keep up, you might sort of drown. In so many words, that's kind of the feeling that they arouse in their students, with the presidents or the administrators thinking that this is exactly what the students need to hear, that somehow if they know what to prepare for, that they'll be able to adapt and navigate those challenges better. Instead, what they're not mindful of is that what they're doing is they're creating the perception that the challenge is something that's stable and sort of a constant within the context that can't be changed. And so that subtle difference from how it should be, which is to convey that difficulty and challenge is normal, that means a lot of people have it, and that it has everything to do with the transition to college, not the college, right? And that simple little difference can be incredibly powerful, because if you're wondering if this is the place for me, and you think that I'll always have to endure this level of competitiveness, then you're going to say, no, I don't want to go there. But instead, if you recognize that it's a transition that everybody goes through, so even though I feel anxious, even though I'm struggling, I know that this is something that's common to all of us, and that it'll pass with time. And that's the second thing that these interventions do, is they convey that these things pass with time. And how they convey these messages is also important. There are a number of very carefully structured strategies that we employed not to arouse the defense mechanisms. Now, I'm a father of 2 children, and I've quickly learned that the best way to get my kids not to do something is to do what? To tell them what to do and why they should do it, right? It's ironic, but you can give someone the best advice, and when you do that, it's not what they hear in terms of your intentions. They don't pick up on your intentions on wanting to support them. What they hear is, I think you think I'm somehow deficient or not good enough. So all of a sudden, I'm going to now take what you say with a bit of a filtered lens, with a bit of defensiveness. So how do you sort of circumvent that defensiveness? There's a couple things that we do, but one of which has to do with sharing other students' experiences. So we're not telling them, here are the things that you need to think about and here are the things that you need to do. We're saying, oh, by the way, here's some stories from upperclassmen who are sharing their experiences with you of what they went through. And so here's a sample quote. When I first got to school name, I worried that I was different from other students. Everyone seemed so certain that they were right for the school. I wasn't sure if I fit in. Sometime after my first year, I came to realize that many people come to PSU uncertain whether they fit in or not. And now it seems ironic. Everybody feels that they are a different freshman year from everybody else, when really in at least some ways we're all pretty similar. Now you might think, this seems pretty simple, pretty straightforward. But again, if you're a student who is wondering whether other students are feeling the same anxiety, a quote like this can be immensely powerful, especially hearing it from someone else who's gone through it. Let's get this one. As I mentioned, there are also some very careful strategies that we employ to make sure that we don't arouse the defense mechanisms. And so we try not to say that this is information that will help you. Instead, we say, what we're going to be doing today is actually getting your input. Because better than us, who are the researchers or the administrators or the teachers, you are the best experts in what the transition to college is. You know better than anybody else what it's like to be a student on this campus at this time. And so we need your help to help us understand our student experiences so that we can inform the next cohort of students about the challenges that they might anticipate. And so now you're sort of activating a benefactor identity rather than a beneficiary identity, which again is a powerful tool. We get them to write their own thoughts around some of the challenges and strategies that could be meaningful to them. This is based on some pretty classic research on cognitive dissonance. It turns out that when you get someone to say something without clear reward or punishment, they're then left to wonder, why did I just say that? And if there isn't a clear sort of incentive for why they said some of these things, they're more motivated to internalize that because they think, well, I must really have thought that. And so we utilize this writing exercise, the saying is believing paradigm, to get people to generate both the anticipated challenges that they might have, but also the strategies that could be useful for them and other students. And finally, timing. So as we talked about these recursive processes, once a negative attribution comes online, it's hard to change that. And so how do you sort of intervene before these issues become too sort of hardened? And timing is critical. In the RCTs, where they've tested these interventions, they have had some pretty promising effects, where the achievement gaps have been reduced by as much as up to 50%. I will say that on a national level, we're having more nuanced conversations around exactly what is the scale of impact that these interventions can have, and what we're finding is that the context matters. That you can have an intervention that's well-designed, well-tailored, well-targeted, but if the message isn't sort of legitimately perceived as being authentic in a campus climate, then that's not going to have the effect that you want it to. So the moderation by condition or context tends to be a big factor in these outcomes. Another example of how these interventions are rolled out is, again, recognizing the importance of timing, is by weaving them into welcome videos, which is something that we've done with a number of schools with great impact.
I remember when I was a freshman coming to Stanford, I was pretty jittery. I was really nervous, and I was just thinking, wow, I do not know anybody out here. And that can be pretty intimidating.
Stanford was just like the great unknown. Knowing that my family had gone to college, so there was no preparing for college speech about what it meant to live in a room with a stranger you don't know. I was scared about whether I would fit in or if my personality, my temperament, some of the things I like to do would be Stanford normative or would have a place at Stanford.
I think that new student orientation is about beginnings, discovering self, discovering others, discovering who you want to be in this next phase of your life.
New student orientation begins the year here at Stanford. And so it's when all of the new students move in on the same day, and then they go through a series of activities together that bond them as a class.
And so it was important because I met my upperclassmen mentors who really shaped my Stanford trajectory. And they just really made sure that I felt at home and comfortable in my first week at Stanford.
When you come into Stanford, you meet a lot of people. So you might meet someone your first day and they might become your best friend for all 4 years.
One great part about new student orientation and everyone arriving is everyone's getting settled in their dorms. There's this real sense of dorm life and dorm pride.
At our foundation, we are about relationship. Faculty member to student in a research project, or even relationship in the collective, in a whole dorm community, in an athletic team. All of that to say we're not about competing at the expense of one another, but instead raising each other up.
This was a place that I found that I could really count on everyone else around me to like have my back. And so when you start talking to other people, you really realize, oh man, like everyone else is feeling just the same as I. And you kind of move past that initial nervousness and you really build a community and a home off of that.
Welcome, students. We are so glad you're here.
You are joining a family. When we say a family, we mean a family.
I want to encourage you to embrace this place and embrace its perfection and its imperfection, and to think about where you want to leave your fingerprints and what kind of legacies you want to leave. But also get your sense that this is your big, beautiful place. This is your home.
Did you pick up on some of the themes that we've been talking about in that video? That instead of touting their pedigree and the accomplishments of their alumni, which a lot of presidents and a lot of welcome videos or a lot of opening speeches tend to do, is they try to lift the reputation of the institution by saying, here are all the wonderful things that we are and have done. This doesn't do that as much. Instead, it kind of normalizes the student day-to-day experiences. It again highlights the uncertainties and anxieties of navigating the transition to college. I'll say that this is actually an earlier version of the video. Every year since we started working with the administration, we've made revisions with input from our team on how to better weave in those intervention messages into the videos, as well as the welcoming speech. We actually, when we first were asked to look at the welcoming speech, it was exactly that. There was a list of all the Nobel Prize laureates that the president was talking about and saying, we expect great things of you. But imagine yourself coming from a background in a rural school where you weren't given the same list of Shakespeare books to read, or you weren't given the same internship opportunities. And the notion of being a Nobel laureate is so far off that for you, it's clearly that this is potentially not what they're talking about. Maybe they're not addressing this speech to me. And so being mindful of these ambiguities and through an equity lens, through an understanding of the uncertainties that students have, is one of the things that we've been able to do in key moments of touch points with students. I'll shift now to another sort of approach, which has to do with mindset. And I'll gloss over some of the findings, some of the concepts, and I hope to spend a little bit more time on this particular topic later in today's session. So as we think about this, think about how can I apply this in my own classrooms. Think about what are the challenges that you might face as you're thinking about incorporating this with your students. So with the mindset interventions, as we've learned, there basically comes into two categories. And this is based on early research observing primates. So what they found is if you take a young animal and you put it into a cage and you give it a schedule of random shocks for an extended period of time, that after a certain amount of time that animal just fails to respond. Even when you open the cage door and give them the opportunity to leave, they have this learned helplessness about what is the point of trying even in the face of potential shock or adversity. Luckily, humans are a little bit more resilient. That early observations from Carol Dweck's work in giving young children negative feedback after doing a relatively difficult task, that as you might predict, some students were like, oh, this was hard, you know, I didn't know how to get through that, and I don't feel so great right now. Instead, there was also a subgroup of students saying, well, I had hoped that this would be challenging. Well, I was really hoping that I would learn something new. So that was the basis of a lot of the mindset work, recognizing that, again, to the same event, that different students can respond in very different ways. And through her work, Carol Dweck has identified that it has to do with our beliefs around the quality of intelligence. That if you believe that intelligence is this innate trait that some people have more or less of, then when things become hard, then that becomes evidence that you're not one of the smart ones. Because if you were one of the smart ones, nothing should be difficult for you. But if you recognize that intelligence is a process where you become smarter exactly by experiencing effort and struggle and stretching yourself, then that is, again, something that will lead you to stay engaged a little bit better. When you think of it, the expectation that we have for our students is to live in that murky space of the unknown. That learning happens when you place yourself at the frontiers of your ability, that place where you don't yet know something, that place where if you raise your hand and ask a question, you could be wrong. And in that place of uncertainty is exactly where the optimal learning happens. And we ask our students to live there without questioning it or without feeling somehow that they need to defend themselves. But that's exactly what matters, is being able to recognize that that experience, that difficulty, that challenge, that uncertainty is not a bad thing. It's not a reflection that you're somehow inadequate, that you're not smart enough. That's what learning is. And as you're probably picking up on, these interventions, they shift the implicit attributions around what does this mean? Does this mean that I'm not smart enough, which has to do with your internal stable qualities and traits? Or does this mean that it's something about the temporary external experience that I'm having? And the latter is the more adaptive set of attributions that people make. In the interventions, what they do is they basically show students sort of literature, scientific literature, talking about the plasticity of the mind, how the brain can become stronger through exertion, that you form new synapses when you're able to sort of really struggle and push yourself, and that in turn will lead to better outcomes. So some of the early work demonstrates that those individuals who were exposed to the growth mindset ended up faring better over a long period of time compared to those who had who were in the fixed mindset condition. That intervention was possible, and that led to better outcomes. And also that the more likely you were to internalize or change your mindset, the better you did performance-wise. I want to come back to how we think about mindset and how we talk about mindset. Because even myself, it would be hard for me to come up here and tell you the value of mindset without showing you the data on outcomes and grades. But that's both a strength of being able to share and convince people of the value of mindset, but it's also a limitation in terms of how well it's implemented. Because it's almost a contradiction. Because when we tell people to focus and value the process with the promise that you'll get better outcomes, so how do you disentangle the two? In fact, the students contend with that tension because now they're being told, just focus on the effort, push yourself a little bit more, and that will give you the outcome that you're guaranteed. But that's not necessarily the case. The other thing that we've been trying to do more recently is trying to tackle a wider range of some of these maladaptive attributions and seeing if we can create a curriculum where we give students sort of a student-facing awareness of what their attributional patterns are with the hope that they're able to adopt more adaptive ones. So at Pitt now and a number of other partner institutions, what we're doing is we're creating a sort of an adaptive mindset skills training program that touches on 11 moments of ambiguity that we think can set a student on a trajectory of better success. This is the first time we're piloting this kind of approach where we're not operating behind the scenes, which is what a lot of these interventions do. They work in stealth modes without telling you what the intent of the intervention is. For the first time, we're actually telling students that these are part of a hidden curriculum. A part of implicit beliefs that if you're able to understand and apply, then again, you can change those recursive processes in your own outcome. I'll give you a quick example, because some of these might seem relatively simplistic, but if you can shift the way that people see these implicit realities, then that could be powerful. When we talk about grit, I have my own sort of hang-ups around this notion of grit, which has picked up a fair bit of popularity in recent years. there is this implicit notion that grit is when you have nothing left to give, that you're able to dig a little bit more deep and somehow endure a little bit more. When you actually observe it in the wild, what you find is that gritty people actually have resilient networks, that they are able to rely on others when they have nothing left to give. And so that simple recognition and articulation of that distinction can lead to very different outcomes. So if a student who's struggling and has a notion that grit means just sort of struggling it out on your own, might persist at the same strategies that are ineffective, where instead, if you see resilience as a quality of your network, you're more likely to go and talk to your teacher or your counselor or your tutoring, and those are the proven strategies that is backed by data. So there are a lot of these implicit expectations that students carry with them as part of this hidden curriculum, that what we try to do is intentionally target them so that students have these more adaptive attributions. I don't have time to go into all of these, but I'm happy to talk about this later. But I will share with you maybe just a sort of video.
I believe the mind skill training would really help people who are freshmen or sophomores and even everyone in college, because if you are that type of person who kind of gets discouraged about when things don't go right, you can learn how you can take those negatives and turn them into positives.
Everyone's coming from a different background, so they might not know the full extent of their capacities because they might just be modeling it based on people in their home or their environment.
You can only do so well academically before your mind starts to limit your academics because of, whatever is going on personally or how you're studying mentally.
Once you have this and once you learn this, it will really benefit you, like from almost every perspective in your life. And also it's not only gonna benefit you as an individual, but also people around you.
These are not actors. These are students who were invited, volunteered to come to this training, and were then asked, would you like to say a couple of words about your experience here? So I'm really proud of the impact that it had, because it really exactly had the intended impact, which is to change the way that people see themselves and talk about themselves with this more of a meta-awareness, this metacognition around that my beliefs have an impact on how I engage or disengage. So there's more work happening here, and we're testing it out in RCT. But I think there's promise there in terms of changing students' attributions, changing the lenses through which they make meaning in many of these modalities that we've discussed. Now, again, what I want to sort of contextualize this conversation around is that it's not just the subjective lens through which students make meaning, that the contextual cues actually have an incredible amount of weight on how students make these attributions. So imagine that you are a student in computer science who's going to see your TA. And you walk into the TA's office, and you see a number of items around the office, as you typically might expect. So a poster of Star Trek, some sci-fi books, some Coke cans. And you wouldn't think twice about it. But what if you walked into the same lab and instead found items that are a little bit more gender neutral? And these seem incredibly subtle. But for students who might be wondering, is this the place for me? And I'm going to talk to my TA about something where I don't think I did well, and that moment of anxiety, looking around the room conveys a lot about whether this is exactly where I should be. And in fact, what they found was that being exposed to the TA's room with the more gender neutral cues led to a greater sense of belonging after being in that condition compared to those who saw the more gender stereotypical room. Another example is, as you probably might be familiar with, some of these flowcharts for courses as part of your major. Unfortunately, the internet is abound with examples of these kinds of flowcharts. If you're asked to come up with decisions related to your major, trying to figure out what courses do I need to take to get to that finish line, and you're seeing these kinds of flowcharts, what does that mean? Now, for researchers who were trying to examine this, what they did was to create an intervention or an experiment where they simulated an experience that we all have had, right? We've gone online and we started filling out these forms. We type in our name, our address, our phone number, we create a password, we hit click, and then sometimes everything disappears. and you curse something, don't you? You just get angry and you're like, what is going on? But sometimes not everything disappears. Sometimes they just ask you to come up with a new password and all of the information is preserved. So what they did was essentially create these two conditions where either everything disappeared or just some of the stuff disappeared, and you were asked to come up with a new password. Fortunately, we did find that everyone who was in the more sort of frustrating experience, regardless of their demographic, found that condition to be more frustrating significantly. But what's really impactful, I think, is what happens when you look at first-gen versus non-first-gen students and how they perceived their sense of belonging in college after they were asked to do the more frustrating task. If I can't even fill out this simple form online, what does that mean? And again, it's these individuals who, for lack of a better explanation, in these moments of ambiguity, have to come up with an answer of what does this mean about me? What does this mean about me in this place? And if you're vigilant to these moments where there is these differential interpretations, then you can become more attuned to creating messages that are more adaptive. So how do we change the contextual cues that are more attuned to these psychological needs that students have? An example of what we did at Stanford is we were, again, asked from the administration to help them increase their retention. So at Stanford, there's a proportion of students who do fall off of the regular standing and go on to probation and then drop out. So they said, can you help us? And I said, well, what's the first touch point that you have with these students? And they said, well, we send them a letter in the mail saying that you're on probation. Now, for the administrator's perspective, this seemed, common business. Like, we have to let them know, give them due notice of what's potentially impending for their outcomes. And that letter, we asked them to show it to us, was, again, as you might suspect, it had a lot of sort of legal, jargony language. It had some clear conditions that the students needed to be met, and it had some clear consequences for what would happen if they didn't meet those conditions. Again, well-intended administrators thought that this is exactly what students would need to then go and talk to their advisors in the coming weeks to find out and come up with this collaborative strategy to get back on regular standing. Now imagine yourself being that student. You know you've been struggling. You know you haven't been getting the grades that you want, but you're hoping nobody knows. You're hoping no one's going to call you out on it. But then you get this letter in the mail, and you're like, oh my goodness. The Stanford institution has now branded me as being a probationary student. In fact, the letters do come with capital P's often, that this is a brand and a label that you have. And what they don't do is they don't clarify the questions that students have around what they think you think about them. So for a student who's struggling, they think you think that they're lazy, that they don't care, that they're just these sort of, goofy, non-committed individuals. They think that you see them in a negative light, and this is just a formality to get them out. But from your perspective, you know that there are very real reasons why you've been struggling. There are family demands, there's financial issues, there's health concerns, and that is not something that's made clear in the letter. In the letter, there's an ambiguity around how you think, I think you see me. And sure enough, when we gave the students, another sample of students, a version of the letter, and we asked them, what are the first sort of thoughts or emotions that you have if you were to see this probation letter? The word cloud here represents the frequency of the words and experiences that students have. So again, in contrast to what the administrators might have hoped, which is that the students see this as an invitation to get back on good standing, that it's a support mechanism, it's a method of getting them to recognize their value. The students felt distracted, they felt stressed, they felt shocked, they felt shame. With the permission of the administration, we asked if we could potentially tweak the letter without removing any of the content to make it more psychologically attuned. So we did 4 things. 4 things that we did were to, again, validate the very many real reasons why students might fall on probation. The other thing that we did was we were able to convey the probation as a process, not as a definition, not as a brand. So we got rid of the P and we created the probationary process in the language. We exposed them to quotes and stories of other students who had been on probation had gotten back on regular standing. Because if you are at Stanford, you actually do feel like you're the only student who's on probation. So seeing evidence that you're not was helpful. And then we very clearly highlighted the intent and the commitment of the advisors who were waiting for them to come and see them. What we found was that students who saw the revised letter had negative experiences of less feelings of negative emotions after the revised letter. They were more likely to go and see their advisors in the 2 weeks following, and they were more likely to get back on regular standing a year later. We're in the process of scaling this intervention across multiple campuses right now, so that data is still coming. But at least the early trials are showing some pretty strong support for what was initially led by a theoretical question of a psychologically attuned focus to the student experience that led to a collaborative effort that was able to change a structural process. Now, the other thing that I'll say, and this is a good precursor to mindset, is that when we talk about growth mindset, it's not just about exerting or extolling the values of effort, that there are other elements that are really important to highlight. And one of those moments where people are wondering what kind of feedback do I give is known as the mentor's dilemma, that as faculty, you are asked to give students feedback on their letters, on their assignments, on their tests, without crushing their hopes and without crushing their sense of efficacy. So how do you do that? Well, you might find yourself giving comments like this, where you get someone to write about something that's relatively important to who they are and how they see themselves, like asking these students to write about my hero, giving the assignment in, and then getting it back with tons and tons of red markings on it. Now, by every sort of definition and standards, this is really great substantive feedback, that you as a faculty were motivated to helping the students learn how to improve themselves. But from the student's perspective, they see it slightly differently. They think, oh, great, you took your Sunday afternoon to go and basically crap on my paper, and you remind me all the ways that I'm not good enough. So how do you quell that perception that that's what the motivation of the faculty was? What they did in an experiment was they had teachers give the kind of feedback they typically give. And then before they handed it back to the students, they attached one of two sticky notes on the paper. So the researchers were attacking one of two versions of the sticky note. The one version said, I'm giving you these comments so that you have some feedback on your essay, which is saying nothing at all, right? It's like, great, wonderful. And that's a control condition. In the treatment condition, what they did was to say, I'm giving you these comments because I have high standards and I know that you can meet them. So now you've clarified your intent for why you're giving all this feedback. Because absent that, a student who may not have that clarity might wonder, am I being negatively viewed? Is this evidence that I'm not smart enough, that I'm not valued, that I don't belong? And the evidence that they have on this is that those students from underrepresented groups actually were more likely to resubmit their papers and do better on those resubmissions, because you've basically clarified the intent for the comments. And there are other, again, as you're thinking about how do I apply this in other contexts and other situations, when you become attuned to moments of touch points with students and recognize that for different groups, there could be a subjective freedom, flexibility. You can also become attuned to how do I change those practices? How do I change those moments so that I can create more psychologically attuned messaging? So moments like the recruitment materials that we send out, the letters that students get when they're accepted, the welcome videos or welcome speeches by presidents. First day of class. What do we all do in our first day of class? No shame. There's no shame here. What do we all do? Syllabus. What are we saying with the syllabus? Here's what matters to me. Here's how you do. Without any pretext, without any creation of a connection, a normalization, and clarifying that your purpose in that room, in that class, is to see their growth. Instead, you give them this legal document and say, good luck. Again, I'm not judging. I've been there, I know the challenges, but if you're thinking around what are little things that I can experiment with, hopefully with this lens that some students who are hungry for the sense of connection, the sense of trust, the sense of being supported, that early moments of interaction are moments when they're the most vulnerable. And if you can even invest 5 minutes, so one of the things that students assume about you as you stand in the front of the class is that you have had success upon success upon success in your life to get to where you started to where you ended up in a clear, predetermined, planned out way. Whereas for them, they're really realizing, I don't know what classes to take, I don't know how to study, I don't know how to make friends. And so instead of saying, here's the core syllabus, maybe there's a way of saying, guess what? Here's a couple of minutes to tell you about my own journey, my own experience, my own sort of challenges that I have, and why we're here, what matters to me instead of the core syllabus here. The general sort of value of these psychological interventions, again, is not to change the way that students see the world or the way that the structural resources are there. It's to remove the psychological gunk that prevents students from utilizing the resources that are there to do the job that they're intended to do. So this underperformance is usually, again, related to the fact that we are finding factors that causes students not to show up. That they show up with a bit of hesitance, they're always looking for the way out because they don't know what the meaning of that context is. As I promised, the more ambitious sort of category is how do we change cultures? Because you can change the students' lenses and you can change the cues, but how do you weave that into a process that is sustainable? And that has to do with the changing the culture. I know I've gone over time, and so maybe someone can stop me, but I do want to just continue if I may. So I'll do it unless someone tells me to stop. A study that I found incredibly powerful, which was done at a time when there wasn't as much sort of oversight around the ethics. So while we're grateful, we're also horrified that this work was done, has to do with observer expectancy effects. And so back in the 60s, Rosenthal and Jacobson went into the second grade classes, and at the time, diagnostic tools were really the vogue kinds of things. So how do we figure out who's going to do well and who's not going to do well? So they went into these classes and they told the teachers, guess what, we at Harvard have identified this diagnostic IQ test that will tell you definitively who your bloomers are and who's not a bloomer. And the teacher was like, great, let's do it. So they gave the students the IQ test. The researchers went and computed the results and came back and gave the teachers a list of names of the students about who the bloomers were and who the non-bloomers were. That's all they did. Then they came back about 8 months later and they observed how their students were performing. And lo and behold, the students that they had identified as the bloomers were in fact doing better. They had higher IQ. Now what they hadn't told the faculty is that the test was completely bogus and that the list of names was chosen at random. So they said, teachers, what did you do? How could you let this happen? And the teachers, in all honesty, said, I have no idea what you're talking about. I treat all my kids the same. But what they probably were not attuned to is that their beliefs were manifested in subtle ways, so that if a student was struggling and they believed them to have the potential to get better, they probably exerted a little bit more effort, a little bit more support. So as we think about student success, as we've mentioned, it is the work that matters. It's recognizing that it's not a product, that we're not going to be able to tell you what interventions to utilize or what messages to change, that it's a process that matters. And why I say this is because you may be hearing about this phenomenon more and more over the next few years, which is the phenomenon of a false growth mindset. So nationally, when we ask people, are you aware of the growth mindset concepts, people say, yes, I got it. I know all about growth and fixed mindset. And yet, when we look at practices in the classroom, there are still gaps and issues with how it's being implemented because there's almost a zero correlation with teachers' mindsets and their students' mindsets. Why is that? Or at least, let me sort of backtrack, let me correct that. There's almost a zero correlation with teachers' awareness about mindset and their students' mindset. There is now evidence showing authentically what the teacher's mindset is also predicts their students' mindset. But that's a very different thing than saying I know mindset. And why that is because we're capturing this phenomenon known as a false growth mindset, which shows itself in 3 major symptoms. One is that teachers tend to sort of overly emphasize effort. That if you want to do better, Jim, just try a little bit harder. You'll get it. That if you do poorly, it's okay, bud. Good try. And leave it at that. That praise is used as a consolation instead of being a cue for being able to invest the time and the support that the student is clearly in need of. And that often, unfortunately, mindset now has become the replacement for what we perceived as a lack of intelligence for neglecting students. So a few decades ago, before mindset was on the scene, if a student was doing poorly, we wouldn't allot as much attention to them because we thought they weren't smart enough. Now what do? We neglect those same high-need students and instead say they're not trying hard enough or they don't have the right mindset. And this is becoming a little bit more prevalent than we'd like to admit. And so the question is, how do you combat this? How do you have more of an internal approach and a sustainable approach to growth mindset that is meaningful? And so what I'll sort of end with is to say, as we think about our solution, that our own mindset about the solution is something that we should be focusing on. That it's not a cut and paste, that no single intervention will work across campuses for different groups of students in the same way. That in fact, we're actually showing now with the College Transition Collaborative that belonging uncertainty, which we thought almost all students combated with, isn't necessarily a prevalent issue for all students on all campuses. So if that's the case, do we have a belonging intervention? Maybe not. Maybe it's more about the process of learning from the students to figure out what are their experiences so that we can inform the intervention. As I mentioned, it's more of a process, not a product. And that means accepting something that I had to accept a long time ago, the hard way, which was that there is no finish line, right? So as a runner, I'd like to think that I achieve certain goals and that will be the end, that I'll be able to retire. And yet consistently I find that I cross that finish line and I'm already hungry for the next goal, the next way in which I can stretch and learn and grow. And hopefully that's exactly how we look at this as well, that you'll never arrive and that it's okay. And what that also means is that hopefully you all leave today and you screw up, you fail, you try things and they don't work. And that's okay too. Because the process means that you're going to experiment. The process means that you're going to try things that you maybe hadn't thought about, a lot of which won't work, and that's okay. But don't be sort of paralyzed by feeling like what you have to do has to be the perfect thing. And it also has to be collaborative. I think what I really appreciate about here is that there has been a lot of conversations around how do we bring everybody into this conversation? How do we work across lines and recognize how we can add value and input into this conversation that is campus-wide? And as I mentioned, our beliefs matter. So if we are not able to recognize that we all occupy a set of both fixed and growth mindsets, and that we're able to criticize and reevaluate those, that we can't have the impact that we want. Have you ever watched yourself, how you react when you get negative feedback or when you fail? One of the times when I was giving this presentation, there was a gentleman at the front of the room who I noticed was sort of staring at me with a bit more rapt attention than everybody else when I was talking about this. Not that, well, there's a whole range, but. But as I was speaking, he just sort of like got taken by a moment of insight. And later he approached me and said, as you were talking, I was reminded of a recent event with my son. He was doing a chess competition. And it was his first chess competition. He'd been training for it for months and months and months. And when he finally got his day, I was sitting on the benches watching him, and he had 7 matches lined up. And I watched him get crushed game after game after game after game. And sitting from the sidelines, my heart was crushed for him. And so at the end of the day, after his 7th loss, I went up ready to console him, and I was shocked to see that he was enthused and excited about his having learned a lot more, having been challenged, having played these amazing players. And in that moment to realize that he may have contaminated or be part of the contamination process that we have with our own children, with our own students, with the beliefs that we have. That somehow failing and losing was a bad thing. And in that moment, he realized he may have rubbed off on his child in a way that he may not have wanted to. And so when we think about our own beliefs, they come out in ways, in moments when we're not paying attention. What happens when we fail? What happens when we get negative feedback? What happens when things take too long? And if that's the case and you're able to become vigilant for those moments, what are the things that we can do to sort of self-reflect and maybe try to challenge those thoughts? Because they are challengeable. And so with that, I'll stop. We are going to sort of continue this conversation with more hands-on activities. But thank you for your attention. There's at least a 30-minute session where we can sort of tap into what does this look like for you all? What are the questions that we have around implementing strategies that others have implemented? And also, what are the challenges that keeps us from doing that? The last thing I'll say also is, again, I've come up with a set of recommendations, a set of strategies. I really fully encourage you to ignore everything that I've said. Because at the end of the day, as I've mentioned, you all are doing things and seeing things that I will never know. And so if you do nothing that I say, do something that you think is in line with your values. Because I know at the end of the day that as teachers, you're here because you believe in your students' potential to grow, that you want to see them flourish and prosper. And so if you do nothing of what I say, I encourage you to do something of what you think might be useful, might be helpful in your own values and your own goals. So with that, I'll stop. As you make your way back to your tables, I'm going to let you know that there's a pop quiz. And you're going to be evaluated. There are no gender or racial differences in how you perform. So hopefully that, I'm sorry? Multiple choice? Yes, it's multiple choice. So we're going to spend a couple minutes with a pop quiz. And this is more of an interactive activity. And then we're also going to do more interactive activity around mindsets and what kinds of mindsets we perceive in ourselves and others. And of course, I want to be able to have an open discussion, quick Q&A around applications. What does that look like for you all in your classrooms? And what are the challenges or best practices that we've observed? So a pop quiz. Consider this real-life scenario. 9-year-old Elizabeth loved gymnastics and was determined to win the local gymnastics competition. She did very well, but not enough to win. She was devastated. And if you were her parents, what would you do? Okay. Would you tell Elizabeth that you thought she was the best? Would you tell her that she was robbed of a ribbon that was rightfully hers? Would you reassure her that gymnastics isn't that important anyways? Would you tell her that she has the ability and she will definitely win next time? Or would you tell her she didn't deserve to win? These are your options. All right. So anybody want to venture a guess or share with us what you think from these options? Yes? Any other thoughts? Yes? Yeah, yeah, okay. So that's the only spin. Interesting. So you're demonstrating how much faith you have in her with your relationship. Interesting. Interesting. Great. Any other thoughts? Yes.
Race number 5. The other chick was better than me this time.
Great. Any other thoughts? There's no wrong answer. Well, there is wrong. But there's no judgment. Yes?
Well, I would like to ask Elizabeth a question about the meaning that she made out of the experience and how it was that she was feeling and what she needed in order to get past this competition and move forward to the next one.
Great. I like it. What's that?
That was not one of them.
No, not one of them. All right, so let's go over some of the answers and why they may or may not be appropriate. So you thought that she was the best. That's not effective for a couple of reasons. One is that it's insincere. That when you give feedback that isn't accurate, that corrodes your credibility. And it also provides no specific way to improve. Right? So giving feedback and praise is only useful if there is a reassurance of the reason why you're giving the feedback, is sincere, and provides specific strategies for improvement. So that's not what you would do. You would also not tell her that she was robbed of a ribbon that was rightfully hers, because then it creates a very hostile sense of competition. What's interesting about competition is that it can embody two almost independent notions. That competition does mean that you're being pushed to do and perform at a higher level, but then the other thing that sort of gets mixed into there is the sense of hostility, which actually does not have to coexist. Like, you can have an environment that's competitive but isn't hostile. That means there isn't a zero-sum perception around what that context means. You see this, I see this in my running races when you cross the line, and the people you've been racing for the past several hours get to the finish line and they embrace you, they encourage you, they give you good feedback. So they're happy that you were pushing yourself and pushing them. And so you can have competition in a way that isn't hostile. And that's kind of a more adaptive thing. And you don't want to blame others in the feedback that you give. You reassure her that gymnastics isn't that important. It teaches her to devalue something if she doesn't do well in it. And that's not necessarily the most adaptive thing. The most adaptive thing may have to be that it's a longer process and it's an experimentation. You know, what's interesting about, I think what a lot of us might encounter on a day-to-day basis as well with our students, is this notion of passion, or this myth about passion, that students believe that they have to, after high school, fall into a major that they're passionate about, which will lead to a career that they're passionate about. And all the while, this perception of passion means that on a day-to-day, moment-by-moment experience, it's this pleasant, joyful thing. And that's what determines whether you are passionate about something. That someday you sort of walk across the corner and there it is, passion beaming. Say, you found me, I'm so glad. Whereas instead, passion is a process. But there's a mindset around passion as well, that passion is more a process of figuring out all the things that you're not passionate about, that you're not interested in, the places where you can't add value and contribute to in a meaningful way. So again, in our day-to-day experiences with our students, they come pre-installed with a lot of this software, but sometimes it's not accurate. And so how do we think about that, and what kind of feedback do we give them that is either supportive or contrary to those implicit beliefs? You tell her that she has the ability and she'll definitely win next time. Success is not guaranteed. And when you convey that, you come across as being insincere. And although it's hard, it's tempting to give reassurances that are supportive and that don't quash their sense of self-efficacy. It's not the most effective way. Or you could tell her that she didn't win, and as someone said, hopefully you complete and contextualize that and say a little bit more. That she didn't deserve to win because of certain strategic approaches, or because it's a competitive environment, because people have high standards and they've been practicing for a long time, and include an element that allows them to think about what they can do better, right? And so that you highlight the fact that in competition, you're not always going to win, but hopefully that will push you to stretch yourself. That will push you to sort of explore other ways that you can achieve the outcomes that you want to, which you may or may not always get. Probably not always, but you can become more likely if you recognize the process. All right, so with that, what I want to do now is it's a sort of an interactive activity. And so what I'll get you all to do, before you do it, but it's telling you what we're going to do, is I'm going to get everyone to stand up, and hopefully we have enough room at the back of the room where everybody can stand along this line, with that corner with a coffee representing how if you believe that a particular trait or quality is not at all malleable, and that corner there is if you perceive it to be very malleable, and in the middle is if you think it's somewhat malleable. Does that make sense? So not at all malleable, somewhat malleable, and very malleable. And we'll talk about some qualities. So you might imagine things like, so why don't we get started? Okay, so everybody get up, and I'll sort of list out the quality, and then you stand along the back of the room based on where you think, how malleable you think these qualities are. So the first one is hair color. Well, good question. All right, so I see a bit of a bias here. There's a skew in the distribution. I don't know if those folks are trying to get coffee, but so hair color. Most people think it's malleable, but a few people don't. I'm sorry? Oh, you're basically independent. I love it. What about your thoughts? Why would you say it's not malleable? All right. That's great, yeah. You can add dye, but it's not going to change the color of the hair. So you can mask it, but it's not really changing the core color of the hair. Somewhere in the middle, does someone want to say why they think it's somewhat malleable? Yes. Yes. Great, great. And so I assume on this end, we think that you can, I see some dyed hair. Great, so you understand the activity, so why don't we keep going with some other qualities. So creativity, again, so try to reorganize yourselves based on how malleable you think creativity is. All right, so I'll start on this side here. Folks who say it's very malleable. Does someone want to volunteer why they think it's very, very malleable? Why is creativity malleable?
It's something that you can develop at any time in a lot of different ways. Creativity isn't just one thing.
Okay. In the middle somewhere. Yeah. Great. In that corner, anybody thoughts?
I think all human beings are inherently very creative.
Lovely. All right. So I think artistic ability kind of falls in the same bucket, so I'll sort of go over that. What about math? So this is something that, again, what about math? So math skills. I'm keeping it ambiguous. What does it mean to you? Not the topic of math, but your propensity to do math. All right, we'll start with that corner there. Anybody think that math is a relatively not malleable trait? Anybody want to volunteer about why math they think is not that malleable? In that corner there?
I had really bad experiences with math classes, and I was taught that there was always a right or wrong answer.
Great. How about in the middle somewhere? Someone else who hasn't spoken up, maybe. Yes?
Teachers matter.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Interesting. Context. Interesting. Great. On that side, yes.
I also had really bad experiences with math classes, and I learned that when I teach myself math, I don't feel so anxious and afraid.
Wonderful. How about extroversion, or how shy you are? You would move around if there's any movement? extroversion or shyness is more valuable?
Prior to grad school, I was the most introverted, shy person I know, and now I teach lecture halls with 300 people without a problem, and you just learn to be out there.
All right.
Great. In the middle, yes? Yes.
As an introvert, you can learn techniques in order to appear or to exist in the extroversion world. So it's, am I actually changing what I am? Not necessarily. What I might be changing are strategies in order to interact.
Great. Someone more on that corner?
I think the more you get to know yourself and be comfortable in your own skin, I think you can accept the ways that you get more energy in certain circumstances versus another, and it's almost like you just become more and more who you are, and I guess I feel like that's almost the opposite of malleability. It's kind of a grounding.
Great. So the point of this exercise is not to talk about these qualities. The point of this exercise is to reflect on what it feels like to reflect on these qualities, what it feels like to think about your own abilities and take a position on where you think you fall along that spectrum, and also recognize that possibly there are moments when you find yourself shifting in different dimensions, that we all have some fixed and growth mindsets. And the other thing that I hope that you're able to recognize is that there is no right or wrong mindset. That the mindsets that we embody will impact the way that we interact with the world. And not to say that one is better, one is worse, but to recognize that we all have a body of these mindsets, and it makes this collage of who we are. It makes this collage of what it is that creates our perception of our students and our agency in interacting with our students. And that reflection process is not always easy, it's not always comfortable. There's a bit of anxiety that comes along with, like, what do I really feel, and what kind of messages do I want to convey to others? So the skew, I will say, is partly motivated by a desire to come across as being more progressive, more thoughtful, and again, there's no right or wrong, and that's a good thing. That means that you are thinking about how do I improve, but there's also value in being able to say, to be honest, there are moments or dimensions where these are the things that I feel. Like, I honestly don't think that I can be a good singer. And maybe it's because my 4-year-old son told me so, but there's still one of these dimensions where I haven't been able to transcend my own mindset, and that continues to be a barrier. So thank you so much for indulging. We're going to sit back down and now have a conversation around what do these things look like in the classroom, and how are ways that we can come up with best practices for you all. How are we doing? That's great. No? That's good. We get to speak up. I started off my presentation by saying that I am grateful to be here, because when I do this kind of work, I learn a lot from the folks who are doing the kind of work on a day-to-day basis. So your sample size of the kinds of interactions and the frequency of interactions can only enrich my understanding of what these things look like. So at this point, we have a few minutes left to either share challenges, questions around how we can apply them in our own classrooms, or if you're willing, tell me what things you're doing that I can then share with other institutions as I move on. So we have a few minutes left for an open conversation, so if there's anything on your mind, now is a great time to chat about it. Yes?
How does grading fit into all of this?
Yeah, grading is a bully, isn't it? Because we try to fit a lot of what we do inside of grading. Isn't that sort of more accurate? We're all given these expectations around how to evaluate our students, and at the same time we have a limited amount of time to allocate to our student development, with increasingly larger classes, more demands, and then yet another pressure to really commit to building a connection and a sense of trust in our students. I think with grading, what I've found is that it's an evil that we kind of have to live with. If I were to design an institution, you can bet that I would sort of really challenge the notion of grading. I would not put students in a class where they're being talked at repeatedly for extended periods of time, where I dictate their schedule and what they learn, when they learn, all with the basis of them being able to regurgitate on a standardized test what they memorized in that class. That is not the optimal learning sort of paradigm for me. But it is the paradigm that we live with. It is sort of the conditions in which we are sort of finding ourselves. And there's value in having grades. It's a metric of progress. It's standardized because it helps the average group be able to excel at a pretty specific set pace. But with that, I found a lot of individuals who question the value of grading to question the practices in their classroom. So you can sort of reevaluate what kinds of benchmarks or expectations you have that feed into a grade with the hope of creating more of an optimal learning experience. So things like being able to give students a chance to revise their assignments before they submit it for a final grade. Things for doing exercises and activities that aren't at all graded. So mixing in a combination of graded experiences and activities and things that are not. By doing that, you're doing something very powerful. My advisor at Stanford, before I became a parent, he said that sometimes the best thing you can do as a parent is to do what your kid does not expect you'll do. So if they're sitting watching TV, go up to them and say, hey, looks like you're watching a really fun show. Maybe you should watch another one. Or if they're doing the dishes because they think they have to, you say, hey, why don't you let me do the dishes and you go and hang out on the couch and play on the phone. And what you're doing with that is you're disrupting the script. Because as you approach them, they already think that you are going to have this sort of scripted message for them. And if you can inject just a bit of sort of uncertainty, then they're more likely to pay attention. So if you disrupt your classroom practices in terms of what you value and emphasize, there's a great deal of value that comes from them sort of feeling like you're not just in it for the grades, that you can really, that they can open up in ways that are important. Great question. Yes?
I think connected to that question, and there are a number of us here at Portland State and elsewhere who are really. So I just said, connected to this question of grading, just want to say that there are a number of us at Portland State and elsewhere who are really looking at alternative methods of grading. So if folks are interested in connecting about that, I'm one of those people. I'm Vicki Reitnauer from Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. You could feel free to connect with me, and I can connect folks to the community here that's exploring that. But I think that one of the things that, and thank you so much for a really great morning session, but one of the things that gets dropped out of the conversation is the role of power. And I think we can't talk about grading without talking about power. We can't talk about equity in the classroom and elsewhere without talking about power. And so I just would encourage us to think about the way that power and the ways that as we are folks with authority in the lives of our students, the ways that we use power against students contributes to whether or not they can move into growth mindset and under what conditions. And I think we don't pay enough attention to that at this institution or really anywhere.
Yeah, no, I think that's incredibly important, and I do try to provide presentations and workshops surrounding these issues of equity more intentionally, around the dynamics, around power, because I think you're absolutely right. Unless we understand the dynamics, so even me as a speaker, I have the privilege of occupying a certain level of privileged power compared to you all, because I come with the presumption of having greater expertise. And so when you ask me a question, you may have a bit of anxiety around, am I going to say something that's potentially not completely on point? And anytime we stand in front of our class, especially when we have the power to basically grade them and categorize them and determine their futures, they interact with us with that in the back of their minds. They're very vigilant for that. You add in sort of structural and demographic and discrimination issues, there's a lot going on. And I certainly agree that there's incredible value in being able to become aware and sort of learn from each other in terms of mitigating those issues. And I also think that social psychology is incredibly powerful on weighing in on these important social issues, but they're not necessarily overlapping all the time. So this morning we focused on the social psychology of student success, but that does not by any means undermine the value and importance what you're talking about, which are these social issues that we do need to be more mindful of. Maybe I'll take a couple more questions because I know I'll be sort of kicked off the stage in any second. One more. Make it good. No expectations. I got all day. Yes.
If you were going to instill in us one takeaway, what would you want it to be?
Oh, great. I think there's a couple of things.
You get one.
I get one.
You'll be graded.
Just that there's an alternative. You know, I think for all of us that do this work, we have so much constraint on our time and our routines and our power dynamics, and we sometimes undermine our own capacity and our own potential to do things differently and potentially a little bit more effectively. When I do the peak performance training with individuals, we look at strategies that allows them to perform at levels that outdoes the competition, and what that's based on is recognizing that you have often more inside of you to give than you sometimes will accept, and that we sometimes forego that power for the sake of the convenient narratives around the excuses and the rationalizations for why we don't. Nobody else is doing it. I'm not given access to the resources. I don't have enough time. I'm too tired. And certainly, I would say this, that most of everything that I would recommend is almost guaranteed to make you fall asleep and go to bed a little bit more tired, but you'll feel a little bit more satisfied when you do go to bed. That the work in itself is ultimately what matters here. And again, there's not one specific strategy. It's really an embracing of the work and the process that hopefully you can recognize you have more power to do than you might let yourself believe. So with that, I'll stop and thank you all for this great opportunity to learn from you all.
Okay, first I want to thank you all so much for staying and hanging out with me to put a bit of what we just heard about into practice. And so I really appreciate what I just heard because he went much more into depth about some of the things that I would like to touch on as practical applications in our classrooms. So my name is Erin Shortledge, and I am Assistant Professor of Biology. So first I want to get a little bit of a feel for why you are here today. So a show of hands will work. I'm interested in student learning. I'm new to teaching. A few. I'm considering new ways of teaching. I'm thinking about building inclusive environments. All right, good thing you're here. I'm skeptical about the need for inclusive environments. Not one. I'm always thinking about how to make campus more inclusive. Okay, quite a few of you have probably thought about this much more than I have, so hopefully I can do this justice. And I really like free, in this case, breakfast and coffee. Honesty? Okay, good. So I'm here for many of the same reasons, and I too am not skeptical for the need of inclusive classrooms. I think I'm here today for a couple reasons. One of the classes I teach is a large majors intro bio course. So that class has anywhere between 240 to 340 students at a given time in the classroom. And then I run 25 lab sections with 500 students in conjunction with that. And my research is in biology education research. So I think a lot about teaching and learning and best practices in teaching and learning science. I'm also the PI of an NSF-funded STEM grant, and this is scholarships in STEM. And so what this grant does is it provides support for high-achieving, low-income students who want to transfer from community college and graduate here at PSU. The STEM program is one of multiple programs that PSU has that I would call STEM support programs. They're often grant-funded, so NSF, NIH, you've probably heard of Build Exito or LSAMP, so we have a number of these programs on campus. And they provide academic, social, financial, and or professional support. So any combination of these support systems. So as part of my research around the NSF STEM program and its success, I want to better understand the impacts of these STEM support programs as a whole at PSU. So as part of a larger research question, I wanted to ask, what is PSU STEM students' sense of belonging? And this is important because the reason that we have so many of these programs is because we have a very low persistence rate across STEM fields. Sense of belonging is thought to be key to persistence, as we just heard about. Sense of belonging can be defined as the experience of personal involvement in a system or environment so that persons feel themselves to be an integral part of that system or environment. So I'm going to show you a little bit of data on PSU STEM students, and I will not stay in STEM this whole time, I promise. But this survey was disseminated in spring 2019. We had 811 usable responses, and this is the distribution of the majors of students whose data I'm going to be showing you here. And of course, the question is also, how do the students who are supported by these STEM support programs differ, if they do, from the other students? So about 13% of the students represented in these data are supported by one of these STEM support programs. And the hatch mark shows the distribution of those students' majors. And some of you may be asking, are the students that are supported by these STEM support programs different than some of these other students? And in fact, they are. So we see that they are more traditional age students, so under 23 years of age. There are more students of color. There are more female students, and there are more first-generation students in these groups. This is because most of these programs specifically target groups that are typically underrepresented in STEM. Okay, so I'll show you a little bit of data. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is some sense of belonging from a sense of belonging scale that we used, and on the left, it's students that took the survey that are supported by one of these STEM support programs, and on the right, students that are not. And this is their some sense of belonging at PSU. And so we see a slightly significant difference in some sense of belonging between students who are part of these support groups, and I'm not saying support group as though it's some sort of detriment, I'm in a STEM program. And so this is something you may or may not expect. We also asked students about their feelings about belonging to a specific group at PSU. First time we did the survey, we allowed them to fill in a group that they thought that they belonged in. The second time, we had a drop-down menu. So students were able to select a group that they felt they belonged to. So students that were part of the STEM program selected a group that they felt they belonged to, and students who were not also selected a group that they belonged to, or they could select none. So what we see here is the students that are supported by these programs, even though all these students seem to identify to a group, the students as part of these programs indicate that they have a stronger sense of belonging than those that are not part of these programs to a group at PSU. And this is a fairly significant difference. What you might notice, is there a pointer? This is too difficult. Okay. The N of that note, that yellow box group, has gone down. And this is because there was a number of students that selected that they didn't believe that they belonged to any group at PSU. So then I wanted to go back and look at the data and say, do those students that selected that they belonged to no group at PSU differ from the students who selected that they felt that they had some sense of belonging to a group? So I want you to take a moment to think to yourself what you think these data will look like. On the left, it's students that reported having belonging to a group, and I took the STEM support students out of this data, and then those that said that they didn't. How does that impact their overall sense of belonging to PSU? So take a moment and think to yourself what this image will look like, and then turn to your neighbor. See what they think. Just with a show of hands, how many of you believe that these two groups will look different? Yeah, I've shown you some data that indicate that's true, and it does. So there is a strongly significant difference between students who say they belong in a group and those that don't to PSU. So that group belonging seems to matter, and even maybe more so than the overall sense of belonging. Hi, Delise. Oh, sure. I'm so sorry. So on the y-axis, there's some sense of belonging from these items that we asked students about on a Likert scale, going from not at all to strongly. I can't remember exactly what they are. And the box plot at the middle shows the mean of the data. And then the edges of the box are the quartiles. The bars go to the 95% interval, and then the dots are the outliers. So what we're looking at is a mean difference between that center bar and the other bar, and then doing a statistical test to compare. Thank you. I'm sorry for not explaining that.
Those are self-selecting groups, right? The students self-select. Is that self-identified as not being?
Yes, this is, they selected, I am answering these questions as it relates to a group I feel I belong in, or nope, I don't belong to any group, I'm not answering these questions. Okay. And these students, when you look at the demographics, they are older students, older than 25, more so than the other population. They are more community college transfer students, and they are more post-bacs. So these groups do differ. Okay, so what does it look like to have a lack of sense of belonging at PSU? There's not really, so I'm sorry, these are data from focus groups. We did follow-up focus groups with students who participated in the survey. We recruited and held 8 different focus groups, and these are some quotes from students in the focus groups. There's not really any incentive to be part of this community. Since it's a commuter school, a lot of people just go in for class and then they go, I'm gonna go home now because it takes me 2 hours to get home. And then they go home. And then there's like no point, you know? So this is from a student that's not part of a STEM support program. With mathematics, I've only maybe seen 2 other brown people. So it gets pretty difficult to have groups and really try to go outside the class and get together because I feel like I'm not on the same level or culturally the same. I don't know how to explain it. So this is what it looks like from the student perspective to not belong. There are students that do feel like they belong, as we saw in the data. In essence, being a part of the whole PSU community is not as important to me as having closer relationships that I've been able to build through Build Exito and over at LSAMP. I feel like being in the STEM program has definitely opened up a lot of doors for me here at PSU. It has also made me feel like a part of PSU. I can't imagine talking to some of my classmates who aren't in a program or something similar, who aren't doing research. I feel like they get lost and don't have a drive and aren't doing as well. It's not that they're not smart, it's just that they don't have something and maybe they lose their focus a little bit. And one more quote from a student that's not part of a program. I spend time in the Multicultural Center, one of the resource centers at PSU. Just being in a place where other students are just like me, complaining about how hard an exam was and just being able to relate to one another and have that kind of empathy with each other is really nice. It's important to me. So what you're seeing here is that students are saying, if there's somebody that I feel like I resonate with, that I can relate to, or a group, then this adds to my sense of belonging, and holistically we might believe that that adds to their persistence at PSU and in STEM. So now I want to ask, are your students like you? So they want to see themselves in other students. Do they see themselves in you? So some of these data, many of you are probably familiar with, of American adults over 25, 30% have attained a bachelor's degree, according to the 2017 census. 9.3% have a master's degree. Just under 2% have a doctoral degree. 1.5 have an advanced professional degree. That alone may well indicate that your students don't feel like they are necessarily like you. So who is in PSU classrooms? We've talked about this a little bit. As we know, PSU has 27,000 students, most of them from the local Oregon area. There's a high transfer population. The majority of students receive need-based aid. There is a large first-generation student population, and 90% of students live off campus. So this is a very distinct student population that also may not have been like your college experience as you were coming through school. So who is in PSU classrooms? How confident are you that you know who the experiences of those students in your classrooms? So on your sheet of paper, there is a packet, and I want you to find the packet that says inclusive practices. There'll be like a sticky pad underneath it, and pull out an item that says our lives lived. And I will say here that some of these items may be uncomfortable for some, so please feel free to not participate in this activity. This is an activity that I have done with students across disciplines, across classes, and across levels. Students respond anonymously. You'll have to share. There's not enough for everyone on the table. Students respond anonymously to these questions with a yes or no. We then collect them, shuffle them, and hand them back out. Students then raise their hands for what another student said. So they're holding the experience of another student in their hands, and they raise their hand for them. So I just want to show you some aggregate data of what our students look like. So these are I've tallied some of the responses. I still have a stack in my office. But of 629 students across disciplines, here is their the percent of students that said yes to each of these items. And that's down there on the x-axis, the percent. So at the top, we have judging others. Almost 90% of our students admitted that, yes, I have caught myself judging others before I even knew them. So they're being honest. Let's move down a little bit. 69% of our students said that they themselves or a friend or family member has been a victim of sexual assault. 52% say that they abandoned their faith at some point in their lives. 43% have been the subject of a racist comment. And 36% say that they take a daily medication for health purposes. So this is a snapshot of who is in your classroom. And I think these types of information are important for students to see in the classroom setting, that they may not be alone. When you do this in a large room and you see a lot of hands raised, a lot of experiences are similar. So things to consider in the classroom, our students may not be like us. They have various similar and dissimilar life experiences, and they enter our classrooms with pre-existing knowledge, experiences, and both inaccurate and accurate perceptions and misconceptions. So thinking about all of these experiences and the diversity in our classrooms, we need to think broadly about what diversity in our classrooms means, and to intentionally aim to meet students where they are. So what is inclusivity? Efforts and behaviors that embrace and make various aspects of diversity, as we just saw, feel included, valued, respected, and comfortable in place. And inclusivity is equitable access to all students with all of that diversity. Inclusive education can be defined as a process of addressing and responding to the diversity of needs of all learners through increasing participation in learning, cultures and communities, and reducing exclusion within and from education. They stress that participation is key for an inclusive education for students, achievement for students is key, and being valued and feeling value for the system is key. So I recognize this is a bold definition and something that we strive for, and I'm not going to fix today. This could be an entire curricular overhaul, which requires support and expertise and cultural relevance training. However, there are small things that we can do as we move forward to meet some of these. Okay, so I want you to think for a moment, are there field-specific barriers in your field to inclusion? Are there classroom-level barriers to inclusion? Are there institutional-level barriers to inclusion? So think to yourself, can you identify some of those potential barriers to full inclusion in the classrooms and the PSU environment? And share a couple of those with your neighbors. Okay, I'll take an example of a barrier to inclusion. Anyone want to volunteer a barrier? I too am patient. I know, I'm sorry. I'm on a timeline. I had one hand back there. We'll have more time to talk in a little bit about these same questions. Yes? If somebody has a politically conservative mindset, it would be a barrier. Absolutely. Political mindset could absolutely be a barrier in a classroom. Great. Okay. There are other barriers to inclusion that both students and faculty and everyone brings with them. Many of these were touched on earlier today, so mindset I'm not going to go into. Stereotype threat was also talked about today. Imposter syndrome and implicit bias. So these are things that we all can bring to any environment that we enter. So for example, stereotype threat. We already talked about this. If a particular group is thought to have some sort of bias against them, when challenged with that particular task, they perform less well. Imposter syndrome. Feelings of inadequacy or being a fraud despite evidence of success. I might be feeling imposter syndrome right now. However, it's important to tell students that if that is true, it is not an affliction. It is not a disease. It comes and goes. Just like we heard from the speaker before, you may experience imposter syndrome in one situation, but how do you work through that space? And implicit bias. It's important to stress to our students and to our peers that we all have implicit biases. Implicit bias is the attitude or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. This is a website that you can go to test all of your implicit biases. It is an excellent resource. It's implicit.harvard.edu. This is something you can use for yourself as well as in the classroom. So I'm going to make some suggestions of all of the things that we have to face. Number one, it's so important for you to let your students know that you believe that they belong to be there. You believe they belong to be there, that you value them. So there's this whole look to your left, look to your right, one of you's not going to be here at the end of this mentality. Students tell me this still happens. So instead, you can say, look to your left, look to your right, introduce yourselves. Why are you here? I'm looking forward to seeing this to the end with you. So from day one, start with that student level of respect. Learn who your students are. This isn't as hard as you think. So in any size classroom, you can use clickers, surveys, note cards, discussions to actually learn something about who your students are. So I'm just going to give you some examples of how I can quickly gain a lot of information about 300 students in my class. So I use a clicker question. What's your major? I don't necessarily know that, so I quickly see the distribution of the majors. I can show this to them, or I can't. It's up to me. What year are you in your degree program? This is surprisingly variable in introductory biology, especially here at PSU. I have 13% postbacks in my class. Okay, what topic are you most excited to learn more about this term? Get an idea of the kinds of things that they might be interested in learning more about. Maybe use some more examples in those fields, so make it a little bit more relevant to their interests. Have you participated in undergraduate research? This is incredibly important for the sciences. If a large proportion of my students say no, yes, I want to, and I don't really know what you're talking about, I will spend a little bit more time perhaps bringing in researchers to talk about what they do, or just highlighting how getting involved, how you can get involved in undergraduate research at PSU. There are a ton of resources that students do not know exists. So I invite my colleagues into the classroom, like Suzanne Estes, who knows about these things, and they come in and they tell the students about the opportunities. This is important, especially if you teach, say, an 8 a.m. class. On an average day, how long does it take you to commute to the PSU campus? We know 90% of our students commute. If you see that large proportion of your students are commuting an hour a day, maybe you could make an agreement with them about, say, tardiness, or what does it look like at the beginning of class, or maybe it's not so penalizing if you miss the first few minutes of class. This is being understanding to our students' actual realities. Same with how many hours a week they work. This is not by any means changing your class, it's just giving you information about who your students are and making your students feel that you've heard them. There are multiple ways of learning, and so therefore there should be multiple modes of teaching. Show the same thing in a few different ways. It may not resonate with everyone the same way the first time. Set an expectation of acceptance, community, and respect in the classroom regardless of the size. So something like the Our Lives Lived exercise. We can use things like group roles. So this is an example of a worksheet from some work that was started by Lisa Wiesel and has been continued by Gwen Schusterman through the HHMI grant. So we use deliberative democracy group exercises that connects a real-world topic, such as a policy question, to the course content students are learning. They work in groups. They are either assigned, they self-select, or we have them rotate a group role. There are reasons for group roles, not because I necessarily care who's the recorder as the instructor, but it gives them a voice, and it provides more equitable conversation. Also, you could do something like group contracts. If you do group work all the time, could you have students come up with kind of some rules to live by, some community-based expectations of behavior and authenticity in the classroom that each person can bring? One other thing, and this was touched on earlier, be very explicit and transparent, or now it's being touched on, about why you do what you do in the classroom. This works surprisingly well. So for example, on the first day, I tell students they will be doing group work. I acknowledge that many folks are very opposed to group work. There is a bias against it, and I acknowledge that. We're in a science classroom. Why do we have to talk to each other? I then go on to show them the list of high expectations that folks like Forbes and Intel and Google have for their employees. And many of those skills can be gained through group work, through collaborative engagement and problem solving. If they have a chance to practice them when they already have to be in my classroom, they're like, yeah, okay. Because these are funny, right? All you have to do is search group work on the internet and then maybe put in or sucks, and you get a lot of memes. I also show them data on why we do active learning in the classroom. So increased structure, or using active learning, using group work, essentially student-centered practices is thought of as increased structure. And so these are some data that I show them that highlight that all students benefit from a classroom with increased structure. And there are certain groups, such as in this case, Black students and first-generation students, that respond more strongly to increased structure in this pretty well-controlled example of data. I then asked the students questions such as, which way do you want to learn? Luckily for me, most of them picked B, at least a majority of them. And I show them that, and I say, okay, it's your fault. Group work it is. Okay, be very clear with your expectations from the beginning. If something changes, let them know. So this idea of this like nebulous test score you have to get an A is not very fair. That moving target, if a student thinks they need to get 300 points to get a B, then they should have to get 300 points to get a B. Right? So those kind of changing expectations are not great. And if something changes, it's fine. Everybody's flexible, just let them know. Evaluate your curriculum for potential micro and macro aggressions. So this is very important, and we talked about this a little bit earlier in the classroom. If you have a student, for example, that is in a classroom and they already feel imposter syndrome, and then something is done or something that is said that immediately causes them stress, anxiety, fear, anger, any of those things, you have lost that student. They are no longer with you, and they're no longer engaged in what's happening in the class. And if that happens too many times, we could lose them for longer. And so this is important to consider in the classroom. There are many resources at PSU that you could talk to and consult with if this is something that you are not sure of how to handle in your own classroom. Note the references and examples that you tend to use. So another example, so go back to that student that has imposter syndrome already in your classroom. I don't belong here. And this could be amplified by existing classroom or institutional barriers. So of the 21,000 PSU undergraduates in the fall 2019, just under 30% of those students were of underrepresented racial ethnic backgrounds, self-identified. And of that group, they will be taught by 13% of faculty that are from those same backgrounds. So it's very possible at our institution, students may not see themselves in you standing up there in front of the classroom. There are things, however, that we can do to reflect diversity in the examples in the curriculum that we use. So for example, this is some work done by Shinsky et al., and this is called Scientist in the Spotlight. They have students go through a series of essays and activities where they learn about particular scientists from different backgrounds, the kind of work that they do, and they write about them. And these are part of regular, ongoing class time activities. So diversify the examples that you use in class, and that can go a long way. If this doesn't resonate with you, the internet is full of terrible things, and the internet is full of amazing things. Right? So for example, Dr. Ford here has an incredible TED Talk on imposter syndrome. I think some of you have seen it with me. It is really fantastic and something I highly recommend. Doing a search for TED Talks, inspirational education talks, they're everywhere. One other thing that was mentioned earlier is be human. Let them know you. This was very hard for me when I first started teaching, but then I recognized that when every student in the class who comes to class knows my cat's name, things got better, right? Because I use them as examples in the classroom. It humanizes me. If you love iguanas or you're a fern gardener, let the students know that. Let them see you a little bit as human, and that makes you a little bit more approachable so they know something about you. And then engage them. Encourage them to think about how they learn and what steps they can take to improve as a learner. So we talked about metacognition briefly before. I want to talk about how you can embed metacognitive activities in the classroom such that you're learning about your students and your students are learning about their own process as learners. So we all have access to Qualtrics. If you're not familiar with Qualtrics, ask somebody. Every single one of you has access to build a survey, disseminate to your students, get a whole bunch of data, and get a great graphic really quickly. It's very user-friendly. It's a great tool. So for example, the first week of class, I asked students to reflect on something that they're concerned about for the term, and then what they're going to do to mitigate that concern. I asked them a couple weeks later, in your course reflection 1, you were asked to propose what you do about potential concerns. Did you do it? I then show them that, look at that, 80% of you did or sort of did what you said you were going to do. This student who said not really says, I think I could have done better with my habits. I did not want to leave improvements to next year, but now I think this has to be the case. For future courses and endeavors, I need to find a better way to plan out my schedule consistently so I do not wait until the last minute to study. Hey, at least they're aware, right? They're ready. And then I have another student here, for the sake of time, I'm going to move through it. But essentially they said, I figured out how I learn, and I'm going to take that, and I'm going to apply it, because what I was doing wasn't working. So this is encouraging metacognition in the classroom, and me as the instructor can read through these reflections, come back the next day, pull a few themes that I saw and relate to them that I read what I saw, and that I am really proud that they are really applying these things in the classroom. And I see you're struggling with time management. Let's talk about that in office hours. Okay, and then before I move on, I did ask students, in essence, in thinking about this sense of belonging, and that in that inclusive education, value is key, and in sense of belonging, value is key. I did ask students at the end of last spring, do you feel like you have made or can make valuable contributions at PSU? So this output is another great thing about Qualtrics. It can make a word cloud for you. So automatic from Qualtrics, from my students' responses, here's a word cloud. But here's what they said about this. Some students say, no, I do not. I'm just one person who cannot make a difference because PSU is such a big school, they don't care about anyone else besides the people who are in charge. One person cannot make an impact, that is how I feel coming to PSU. So this person does not have a sense of belonging. Another one of my students said, I don't really feel like I have, or I really will, make valuable contributions at PSU. I don't feel like I'm particularly a standout student or have the potential to make such of an impact. It's not that I don't have any ambition or desire to make an impact, I just don't have any confidence in myself that I can actually do it. I've always been a coaster in school, and while now I have high goals set, I still struggle with believing that I can actually accomplish them. I lie awake at night full of anxiety that I'm just going to fail. So some of these interventions that we've been talking about might really help students like this in knowing that they're not alone in thinking about this. And then I had some really amazing reflective responses from students in the same batch. I feel like I've made valuable contributions with just my existence as a woman of color on campus. I am also part of this Build Exito program. We're here at PSU, which I know will help make some contributions, not only to PSU, but also to OHSU. Just a few more, and then I'll let you go. I think so. I want to eventually be a physician, but I gotta take it day by day and complete my bachelor's. I wanna show other Hispanic youth that if I did it, they can do it too. I wanna leave an impact, especially in the Hispanic community here at PSU and outside PSU. There are a lot of kids who doubt themselves, and I understand this because I was once that kid too. But I've learned what my strengths are and used them to my advantage. I enjoy school, love to learn, and know it's a long road, but overall can be an enjoyable one. Our students are pretty amazing, right? Okay, last one. And to me, this kind of summarizes sense of belonging in a way that we may not think of it. We think about this big thing, but this student, I like the way they talk about it at kind of this discrete level. I feel like the greatest contribution I have the ability to make at PSU is to remain positive and supportive to other students. In college, it's really easy to get down on yourself, so I always try to remind myself and others that you're more than your GPA and encourage people to remember why they started and just keep their heart set on their goal. Also, just being a decent human being represents PSU well, and I'm proud to say I'm a PSU student. So the student says, hey, I'm a good person. I engage with other students. I keep them up. Yeah, I have value here, which is super cool. Okay, so I would love to ask you all to come back after your break so that we can kind of dive a little bit more into these questions about what we can actually do in our classrooms. So thank you so much for taking the time, and I hope to see you back here in, are we still good with 10 minutes? Okay, all right, thank you so much. I appreciate it. So now I want you to think a little bit more about your own experiences. So on that same sheet where you pulled out the Our Lives Lived workshop, you'll find some round circles, and you'll find some images with some letters on them. I want you to look through those images at your table and choose one that represents teaching to you. When you decide on one, write the corresponding letter on a round sticky and stick it on the sheet that says teaching images at your table. This is what's called an icebreaker, as well as a community building activity, and for you to learn a little bit more about one another. Icebreakers I recommend using in your classroom. You can do them. You can Google icebreakers that don't suck. Literally, that's a thing. You can Google it, and you can read through them, and choose one that resonates with you. They may not all resonate with you, I get it, but the purpose is community building. So, by example, an icebreaker. Okay. So just to ponder these questions as we move forward, do you know who's in your classroom? Do your students talk to one another? Do your students know who you are? What can you do tomorrow? As it relates to inclusivity, what can you do next year? And what does your imposter syndrome self think that you could never do? Okay, so on your own on worksheet 1, and now you don't have to share anymore, you can take a moment to reflect on yourself. There is a worksheet for everyone on the table. You can, number 1, part A, list actions that you do now that you believe may promote or support inclusive learning environments. The next one asks you to list ideas that you have for increasing inclusivity in your learning environment. So maybe something you haven't done, but you have ideas about. And then what steps could you take to implement some of those ideas? So I will just give you about 10 minutes to work on this on your own. We'll then come back together as a group. You will talk about it, but first I want you to focus on self for a moment. Okay, you will not be evaluated on this, nor am I checking you for completion. And this is something you can do on your own as well. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to part B, which is with a small group at your table, take about a full 15 minutes and briefly share an action or idea that you wrote down for A1 or A2 with your colleagues. So allow each person to share something that they came up with. Discuss if that action or idea would work in each of your learning environments. So that's the first part. For those of you that are ready to move on to the next step, and it's okay if you're not, I want to pose the next action. So as a small group, choose an action or one that you come up with yourselves and sketch out how you could incorporate that idea into your learning environments. And there's a list of actions on your sheet. It's the same list up here. If there's something you don't know what that means, call me over, ask someone at your table. But here are just a list of a lot of things that you could incorporate today into your classroom to some extent. And if there's something that's not on this list that you've done, I think that that's great. So really think about if there's something in particular that you could hold on to that you can see yourself implementing in your class right now, or in the learning environment that you exist in is fine too. So I'll give you a little bit more time on this. So I would love to start this off by asking some folks either to report from a table or from your own personal experience on what you talked about as it relates to enhancing inclusivity in your learning environments. So are there examples of things that you all do or ideas that you have that you feel are worth sharing? So I think the folks that are still here are really interested in practical applications and thinking this way. So we'd love to hear from you. So I will take our first bold volunteer. All right, right here. Thank you. What's your name? Carol. Carol, thank you.
So my name is Carol Gabrielli. I'm the Director of Student Success in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Dean's Office. And I utilize my business cards with great frequency when I work with students and when I do workshops for McNair or Build Exito or whatever. And I've been meditating on when I write something on the back of my business card before I give it to a student, what is it that I want to communicate? You know, what would be one just one sentence that I want to impart to all of our students. And I had played with, you know, an idea of like I want to be helpful to them or I want to be able to assist them, but I realized that sometimes I am not really able to help them totally endure a conundrum that they're experiencing. But I've recently landed on writing to students that they're always welcome in our office in Kramer Hall 341. And for me, that has been a good place to land because I think that sense of offering, you can always come here. You can always get a cup of tea, you can always get a granola bar, whatever it is, and you can always get some amount of time, and that perhaps then it can be helpful. But for me, that sense of just trying to distill what is it that I want students to know, no matter how brief the interaction.
And it's tangible. I like that. Something they take with them. Thank you, Carol. Sure. Are there any barriers, you think, to this particular practice? I don't want to put you on the spot, but is there something you can think of that might inhibit that working in the way you want it to? Do you have another idea back there?
In this moment, I can't think of any barriers. I try to be thoughtful when students do come, if they are coming on the fly and I am unable to commit time, I always tell them I'm very interested in hearing from you, and maybe I can't just extemporaneously engage right now, but we schedule time.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. I saw a hand right back there. And do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jennifer Alcaswini, and I support community-based learning, which I'm not going to pitch, but I am subtly, as an inclusive practice. But I think a barrier to the always welcome is if Carol's not there, is everyone else in the office embracing that? Or is there someone there, not to pick on class, but I think that it's a risk for a student to put out that they need help, and then they think that they're going somewhere where they're going to get help, and wherever it is on campus, if they show up and they're not getting met with that welcoming presence, they probably won't come back again. And so I think, how do we make sure that the always welcome is embraced if we're putting it out there everywhere?
Can I respond to that?
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it connects to what it means to do this work in community. I mean, I think to Aaron, to your, image earlier where, look to your left, look to your right. That's a classic kind of understanding of like one or two of you are not going to be here anymore. But, an inversion of that is look to your left, look to your right. You are responsible for those two persons' success and moving forward. It was another framing of that, we don't get to the finish line unless we get there together. So I think that part of the work is to take time, like this morning, where we get to say these things out loud to one another so that we know there's an interdependence and a shared responsibility for doing those things, so that even if one of my colleagues feels like they're totally stretched and have 1,000 more emails they need to respond to, having heard me say that, they know, well, that's part of what Carol wants to communicate. Then how am I also helping Todd or Delise or Matt or others in my office put forward what it is that they want? Yeah.
Thank you both. Other ideas for inclusion in your classrooms? We've heard some outside the classroom. I'd like to hear something for inside the classroom. So share ideas. Todd.
I'm biology department, also in the class dean's office. So this is super awesome. I mean, it's been a few years since I've been in the classroom, but I'm itching to get back at some point. I love teaching. But one of the things I've noticed amongst talking to all our GTAs as we think about training and their lived experiences, which we are doubling down to make sure they also get this level of training, is that from my own experience, it took me many years at PSU to realize how important it is to check my own assumptions about who's in the classroom. And many of you have been here a long time. I've only been here maybe 11 years or something, 12 years. The students in the classroom today and their lived lives and experience, which is why I love the our lives lived experience, are not the same students in many ways in terms of their experience that I started teaching at PSU. And I've only been here just over a decade. And I think we have to just constantly remind ourselves and have those approaches by which we can check our assumptions of who's in the classroom, the examples we use, all that stuff. And so any little trick or intervention we can do to remind ourselves as profs, like, whoa, this is the lived experience in 2020, which even in this economic age and sort of age of vulnerability and insecurity may be very different than it was in 2017. And so we actually need institutional processes to give that level of granularity and data to every instructor in the classroom. And that's something I would really like to make sure we could get to, is like, who's in the classroom and how do you know, just to help us out. Just an observation.
Great, thank you. I heard some folks talking about specific interventions and specific ideas and things that they do in the class. Are any of you willing to share? I'm sure there are other folks that want to hear about those. Yeah, right here. In the red.
I was sharing with my colleagues that I find it very useful to have my students know a little bit more, read a little bit more about the notion of empathy and understanding others and the importance of projecting ourselves into the circumstances of others. So I guess I'm lucky to a certain extent because part of my field of the research is empathy. So I get to do that a lot in my classroom as part of the content, but I think there are other ways that perhaps I can incorporate it in other types of classes by asking them to do those readings or having discussions in class at some point, and maybe doing some activities that incorporate that kind of thinking about the other.
I love the idea of empathy. Do you have a discrete example that you could give us of what that might look like so that we could think about it?
Well, from my own discipline, it would be how narratives can foster empathy.
Okay.
And in films. So what do films and narratives do for us in helping us understand the other?
So they watch something or read something and then reflect on
we read theory about both empathy and the power of narratives to foster empathy, and then we have discussions about that. That would be as part of the content of the classes. But I'm thinking about other ways that I could implement this in other types of classes, language classes, for example. That would be very important that we also get to teach in my department, and maybe other disciplines can incorporate that too. Or maybe outside of our disciplines, we can do that as a college, as a university. Which are the ways that we can actually foster everybody's projection into the circumstances of the other?
Yeah,
and that will work for...
We should definitely be talking across disciplines and departments because we all see this a little bit differently. And I think that your point is well taken by me, that if I hadn't specifically thought of empathy, but you have, and it'd be great to talk about
And I think it's also a key notion for diversity.
Yeah,
So hopefully we can bridge those two.
Great, thank you. Any follow-ups or questions or thoughts on the empathy idea, or another example of what you do in your class to promote inclusivity? Yes, right back here.
So this is another example. One of the things that we talk about in a lot of my classes, or that I make it a point to talk about, is talking about, I'm in in linguistics, and we talk about two things. One is the role of language in creating barriers and access and sort of attitudes about language and whose standard we're going toward in including or excluding people, and what it means to speak the standard, and how that gives you access to communities that you wouldn't have otherwise. But I also try to talk about kind of what I would call the hidden curriculum of the academy, in terms of, and it's usually in terms of sort of acknowledging my own, what I would call academic privilege. I come from a long line of teachers, back into the 1800s, and I have several family members with PhDs, and so when that 2% comes up, it's like, okay, in my family, it's like 40% of the people have PhDs, which is, not usual. And so I say, look, I came into this with knowledge that most of you don't have, and this is knowledge that I didn't need to have made explicit, but, it shouldn't be, we shouldn't use that as a barrier for you just because you don't know that. And these are the kinds of questions we can ask, or these are the kinds of expectations we need to question for our work.
Absolutely. The idea of understanding the capital that underlies what a student needs to succeed in academia are those unwritten rules in a lot of cases. And I think that a lot of us try to unveil those, but we forget what we didn't know, or in your case, always knew.
Right.
Yeah. Right here. You get up. And please introduce yourself.
Thank you. So my name's Tim Finn. I'm an instructor in the School of Business, and I teach information literacy. And so I'm part of a pilot project with the Global Classroom, which basically has a lot of recording hardware set up to record lectures and everything else. So I'm kind of supporting students of all kind of, I guess, time slots. So in my lecture, I live stream the lecture so people can participate actively remotely, but I also post the recording after the fact. So my students can get it either on campus, synchronously, off campus, synchronously, or asynchronously, so that way it supports kind of all students depending on what their schedule is and everything else. And at this point, I have about 8 to 12 students that will participate remotely out of 50. So. Which is, it started off as like 2, but so that way it's, really supporting them kind of in all time slots. So.
Did you talk to the students about why they've chosen to participate remotely by chance?
So I've had more this term. So I would say last term when I was doing it, it was probably 3 to 4, but I wasn't sure if I could support all of the moving parts while it's still being prototyped. And so it wasn't something that I messaged in the first lecture. So at this point, a lot of them is just commute. Like 3 or 4 of the students, like last term, one of them was like, I have a 2-hour commute each way. And he was like, so if I can get this content remotely, and he basically participated remotely, like 7 of 10 lectures, and then the others he caught the recording. And he was like, I literally gain 2 hours because class is only 2 hours. He's like, it is purely a transaction. And I would say that's kind of the majority of where my students are at. Or if like they have something come up health-wise, I have parents that are in my class and something comes up with their child. Hilariously, they'll like email me like, I'm not gonna be in class today. And I'm like, that is totally fine. That's why I record the stuff. So I mean like I was like, thank you for being professional and telling me, but I hope your kid is okay. It will be there for you, kind of thing. So I would say those are probably, by and large, the 2 biggest things.
That's really cool. Does anyone else not know about this program? Other folks not know about this? Yeah, I didn't know either. Could you maybe just frame what this program is a little bit?
Yeah, so the dean of the School of Business, Cliff Allen, has been really an advocate for kind of adding value to students being able to participate remotely. So over the course of the last 1.5 years, this has been an ongoing process. And so basically there are 2 cameras that are in the room, and then we have ceiling mics as well. So we basically have the logistics of a standard like 50 or 60 student classroom set up so that we can live stream either the instructor or student participation. Generally speaking, we just live stream the instructor. We do it through Zoom, but you can get full instructor lecture along with screen share and everything else. And at this point, we have it pretty much as a finalized working prototype. So it's going to be launched to some amount of the classrooms in KMC. I'm not sure how many and all of that, but it's something that Cliff was really an advocate of launching, I think primarily for the master's program, because we have a lot of participants that will be having to travel, right? And then if they miss 3 of 10 classes, like what is that value to them? And even if they catch it as a recording, are they able to collaborate with their cohort and things like that? But it's been highly successful with the undergraduate programs we've used it into.
Great.
And it also makes things easy for instructors, quite frankly, because in the past, instructors would have to go and get like a tech person to do all of the recording and everything else. And at this point, I can just like hit 3 buttons and not have to worry about it.
Right. In the RLSB classroom, we have it's not a live stream, it's just a recorded stream. But it's been incredibly helpful for students for all kinds of reasons. Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. If you want to talk about research around it, let me know. Okay, I have a couple other discussion prompts, although I'd like to hear if any of you had anything that you wanted to discuss that we didn't get to. Are there ways that you believe PSU can better foster a sense of belonging for more students? I would love to hear your thoughts on this. And then I will also ask you if you think today's classroom looks different. Actually, Todd already got to this. If today's classroom looks different than tomorrow's classroom, so even looking forward another step, not from the past to present, but from present to forward. So I'd love to start with the sense of belonging if folks are willing to share how you think we could accomplish that. Or ways that we are already actively thinking about how to improve sense of belonging. Yes. Do we have a mic? Oh, thank you. Right here.
I don't really have a specific, but I want to reiterate something that you touched on a bit, Erin. My field of research is higher education and students and college student success.
All right.
And several of my doctoral students are working on their dissertations right now, and they're around sense of belonging. That is the thing that we're talking about. And to point out something that you actually said in your data is that students are connected in their sense of belonging to a smaller group than the whole institution. So sometimes we try to think about how the whole institution can create a sense of belonging when it's more about finding all the list of places that students connect to the sense of belonging, whether it's a specific affinity group or if it's the college or school level. That's what makes a difference to students in the long run. That's their perception of sense of belonging, and it's truly about perception. It's not what you provide. So it's about how they perceive their sense of belonging. So really looking at it at a smaller level does make sense because that's where they make the connection.
Yeah. Some of the data I didn't show you, we coded all of our focus groups because we wanted to better understand the quantitative sense of belonging survey, how this looks different for different students. And we categorize the different types of belonging that a student might talk about, and over again, and this gets back to our morning's talk, it's social. It is, okay, they can have the financial support, they can have the academic support, they can have the help from the advisor, but it is, do they have a support system that they can go to and just say, hey, this is rough for me too, just like one of those students said. And it's, what does that look like for what does that look like at PSU though, right? My question is always, this is different for a non-traditional commuter university with older students who are returning. I was once one of those students. I was the student that did my stuff and went to my job. So it's an open question for me on how to facilitate that.
So then there's also the research around not all students are looking for a sense of belonging.
Absolutely. Yeah.
How do they then interact with our campus? And it is in the classroom, and that's the academic sense of belonging.
Is your mic on? Could you all hear her? No. This is a very good point. Here. Is there another mic? This is a very good point.
Ooh, there we go. That really is on. That not all students are looking for a sense of belonging, particularly at a commuter campus. So the research on commuter campuses is actually different than residential institutions. And it's not that they are commuter students, although that's part of it, but it's also a commuter institution. So there's that kind of dual look at it. They are looking for a connection to the academics, and they are then going to drive away. And that has to be okay as well, but how do we increase their academic success? I'm on the right pillar, I just realized that. Without actually having to go into that sense of belonging, because it's not the same. So just recognizing that our students have different needs for this, not everyone fits into that box.
That saliency may be totally different for that group of people, absolutely. Thank you.
One thing that I think is true for lots of our students, I was really struck by the Stanford video. One of the lines in it was, "We are really glad you're here." And I think too many of our students have the feeling that we're really glad that their tuition dollars are here, and not that we are really glad that they are here. I just hear over and over from students that, they miss one payment and the fees rack up. And, that becomes just this snowball that they are in front of and it's rolling over them. And a real sense of even when they try to get that worked out, there are too many barriers to overcome. And so in that sense, I think there's no amount of connection that they can have with caring faculty members and other folks who can help them feel like anything but a dollar sign to the institution. And I think we have to figure something out around that and actually make changes, but also change the culture that even at a big school like this, even where people are commuting, they have a sense that it matters that they're here.
Absolutely. That we value them. Yes, right here. Thank you.
To the earlier point about the different kinds of belonging, and I think it's worth sort of reiterating that at least as we've been thinking about it, you're right, there are different forms of belonging concerns that the ones that we focus on, as I mentioned, typically focus on the uncertainty of whether you do belong. Because when you have that question, you're constantly carrying this burden of trying to make meaning of the different events that you encounter. And part of the issue there is that you're never given a resolute answer. And so you're kind of sort of pulled along, always wondering if you do belong. And that's psychologically very taxing. There's also the issues of knowing that you don't belong, which in some ways is actually better because you might sort of face overt racism or discrimination. And that clearly tells you that you shouldn't be there, but at least you have closure. At least you have some sort of decision around whether this is where you want to be or not. I'm not undermining the gravity of those kinds of belonging issues, but at least there's the clarity. And then there's a third one that you alluded to, which is the not wanting to belong. And what's interesting about that is you're right. To a certain extent, there are individuals who sort of see this as a transactional relationship, that I'm here to take my courses and move on. But we've also found that there's a subversion of that that's also showing its head, which is that sometimes students feel like they don't want to belong because they think other students don't want to belong. And so there's this sort of almost strange manifestation of the pluralistic ignorance where you think you don't want to be there because you think nobody else wants to be there. And the reason why you feel that is because it's kind of a contagious thing. So interventions that can sort of target that perception can also be effective. With belonging, it's surprising how many of us actually do want to belong, even when it is transactional. So I'd be curious to know if you or your grad students are thinking about kind of looking at the implicit perceptions around how they see others wanting to belong, and if that can be intervened upon. So I love that you brought that up. Yeah.
Excellent. I love this conversation. And I think that we can finish with that because it's time to move to our next speaker. So thank you all so much for participating. I really appreciate it. Really good thoughts.
I've never really talked about my passions for like what I wanted to research before.
When I moved here, I was felt really alone. I was in darkness. There wasn't much of a path for me.
I don't have anything to offer this person. Like I don't belong here.
A lot of times I had people questioning my ability or people just assuming that I didn't understand either the language or the material.
And I didn't really have a reflection of who I was, and so I doubted myself. I always doubt myself.
I had people telling me, see, there's no way you would succeed. I mean, do you think you're really going to succeed in science?
I have this end goal that I want to get to, but I'm not sure how to get there.
I come from nothing. I am completely alone. Until now, I'm surrounded by people that offer encouragement and support and believe in me in a way that I've never experienced.
All of the mentorship. So there are the academic advisors and the career advisors, the laboratory mentors, all of us together collectively to improve science and improve the working conditions in science.
Every day I'm understanding myself a little bit more just by being with these people and actually feeling like I can actually talk and feeling like I have a say and feeling that I can be something and do something in my life.
Not just about being welcomed, right? Like that was awesome, being welcomed into a place because she's a very warm human being, but being told that I was valued and then having that modeled every single day and being able to be trusted with important tasks, and then it's okay if something is wrong, let me show you how to do it appropriately.
He didn't want it just to be a research experience, but he wanted it to be like a personal growth experience too. He was very patient. I've cracked so many fish tanks in that lab. I've cracked so many things.
One thing that I loved about my mentor relationship with my PI, Dr. Blakesley, is the fact that immediately when I entered her lab, she asked, what is it that you'd like to learn?
With my career mentor, we got to present to Congress in DC, which I loved because it was for art and science education.
The opportunity to have doctors and PhDs invest in us with their time and their expertise is really exciting to me, and it's an opportunity that most people don't get.
I feel like everybody in Exeter kind of became like my aunt and uncle, or like an extra mom to me. So it's just been a really beautiful experience, and I'm just happy to be part of this little family we have here.
As a student, as a person coming into a new field, it is not only incredibly important to learn the skills, right? You can't do the job without the skills, but those personal connections and that feeling of belonging is so incredibly important. I don't know if I could keep going in doing this. And with the mentorship, I have no doubt that I can do this and be successful.
Can you hear me okay? I know there is, actually I know there's no lunch, but there's lunch and there's you, and I'm the only thing standing between you and lunch. So this is a tough place to be. But this is great. This is the first time I had a chance to present to everybody, and we have some preliminary findings from the first 5 years of Éxito. You probably have heard a lot about Éxito. I'll talk about a little bit how it impacts student success, maybe a quick description of the program, and what we want to do next. Éxito responds to an NIH interest to diversify the biomedical workforce. If you look at this slide, BUILD stands for Building University Infrastructure Leading to Diversity. So if you look at this, and I don't know if you can see it, but on the first column, it shows the diversity of the biomedical workforce, and they're underrepresented and represented. That's the associate degree. And if you go all the way to the end, you can see how we have killed every sense of diversity in biomedical workforce, where only less than 10% of the full professors come from underrepresented backgrounds. So this is a huge problem for NIH, because they do know that a more diverse workforce create better science, and NIH is not the kind of agency that says things without having evidence, and they're looking at citation index, and they're looking at diversity of authors, et cetera, and they know that the science hurts when it's not diverse. You have the same people doing the same research, so they say, let's do an experiment and see what works. Éxito is a proposal that we submitted to NIH to answer that problem, or try to provide some answers. We are 11 institutions. You met 418 students on that video. Actually, I don't know if we had the opportunity to see all 418, but we have served 418 students, and they come from Portland State, they come from Portland Community College, they come from as far north as Alaska, as far south as American Samoa, as far as west as Tomorrow, Guam, and we have somebody from Puerto Rico with me. So we cover the whole U.S., and it's a very diverse group of students. In Éxito 1.0, you probably heard, we receive a lot of money. We spend most of it, which is good. We are one of 10 universities nationwide who are doing different experiments. It is a training program, but actually we're doing an experiment. We're not doing weird things with the students, but we're giving them what we think works. A lot of things that we have discussed today. It matches different things that Portland State is interested in doing: access mission, partnering with community colleges, addressing health disciplines, collaboration with OHSU, and student success. In Éxito 2.0, which we received notice on July that we're funded for 5 more years. It's not as much money as last time, but still a lot of money, and I look forward to spending all of it. We emphasize 4 areas. We call it SEED: sustainability, enhancement, evaluating, and disseminating what we're doing. Primarily, there are 2 cores to this grant. One is working with the students, and NIH has been doing this for a long time. They've been giving money to universities to train students. It's the institutional part that is actually more important in this case. You can do all kinds of things with the students, but if institutionally we're not changing our culture, if institutionally we haven't created the infrastructure to support the students, all the money that you have given would probably not provide the results that we want. It's an experiment, and as researcher, we have an exposure, we have an outcome, we have dependent variable, independent variables. We propose to do 4 major things. One is, and things that we're doing. So we're not exactly doing something that we're not fully familiar with. We provide the students with experiential learning. We provide the students with a mentoring program. We try to align our curriculum with their student experience, and we provide a supportive environment. And you want to operationalize all these 4 things. There are many things that we do. There is a research learning community. There are peer faculty research mentors. Many of you have a role in this program. either as a mentor, directly as a faculty mentor or a research mentor. We have peer mentors. They provide different needs to the students. We work with curricular enhancements, university studies, honors programs. We have provided funding for faculty to do research and have tried to improve grants proposals going to NIH. And yes, we provide financial aid, and we provide enrichment workshops for the students to be prepared when they show up to do their research. And we have outcomes, and I'll share with you some of them. They're more than just these ones, but one of the things that when we started this, we actually didn't know what we were doing, but now we do. And when we put it on paper, it's a rather comprehensive project. You start very small with an orientation, and then you follow that up with their sophomore year. They do research gateway course. They get some networking experience. Then one summer, and then the whole year, and then another summer, and then finally they ended up with their bachelor's degree and applied to graduate school. So all these things are highly choreographed. Life happens, by the way. Life happens, and not everybody goes smoothly stage by stage. But when we talk about structural programs, they do like to see what is it that we're doing and where are they, and they can monitor their own progress. Diversity is defined as students who come from underrepresented backgrounds, as students who have a disability, or students who have been in foster care system. We have a quite diverse group of students. By the way, this is not, one student might be more than one of these pies. But you will see that we have students from different places, culturally, politically, racially, gender. It's a very interesting group of students. And what we actually tell them, and Carol has helped us here, is don't leave yourself behind. We recruited you, and we want you to bring all that improvisation that you had to do all your life to the lab, because that's what your research mentor wants. He wants somebody who looks at a problem and looks at it differently. And so you have an imposter syndrome, but no, you are you, and we want you in the lab. And that seems like an easy message, but it actually takes a lot of repetition. It takes a lot of reinforcement for them to believe in themselves and bring themselves into their research. Some early findings, our GPA of the students is compared to other biomedical majors. It's a little bit higher. In first year retention rate, it's about 98% compared to 82%. And this is data from PSU. We also have data here from our partners. The GPA of the students increase. It's around 3.4, and we keep monitoring from one cohort to the next. We recruited, these are the first 4 cohort of students. The first cohort, we recruited about 74, then 94, 97, 96. Retention rates at the end, the last bars, it's around 77 to 86%. The longer they stay in the program, the higher the chances that they might not complete. But these are good numbers. We follow the students very closely to know why is it that they didn't finish. And they are humans like all of us. They do have issues. We can't help them take their tests. We don't work with, we don't provide that kind of support. We supported other parts of their life. But they stay together. They help each other as a group. What are we going to do next? So we actually, one of the things we do know is that many students have gone to graduate schools, some small schools back east like Harvard Medical Schools and Yale University, but also some at schools here in the West Coast. But they have learned to believe in themselves. Many of them would have never applied to these schools. But after their training, they feel they have self-efficacy to do this. And many of them are actually at OHSU. There is a lot more things that we would like to do, and you can, I could share the slides if you want to contribute to any of our future challenges. But one of the things that we would like to do is to establish an Office of Undergraduate Research and Scholarships at Portland State. So any student, doesn't have to be a biomedical major, by the way. Biomedical goes from biology and chemistry to community development, anthropology. We have students from over 17 disciplines at Portland State. But we would like to expand this to any students who want to do research, either in humanities, either in languages, either in political science, whatever, that they have a place to go. We have tested the model. We have the infrastructure. We have an idea what works. We have an idea of things that are very expensive and do not work. We want to get rid of those quickly. But we are in that process, and we would like the faculty actually to take advantage that we have 5 years of funding to finally establish an Office of Undergraduate Research and Scholarships, so any students who want to participate can do it. There are challenges ahead, and we look forward to working with you. And I think because you stay until the end, there is a coupon for you to use at any of the food carts outside. I made that up. Yeah, so that's my last slide. And if there's any question, more than happy to answer it. Yes.
So at our table, you mentioned being able to scale up
Yes.
this type of support for more students.
So the question is, we talked earlier about scaling Exito up, and this is about the Office of Undergraduate Research. Yeah, so we have an infrastructure in Exito. We're working with LSAM, McNair Scholars, and some of the other existing training programs. There is an ad hoc committee in the Faculty Senate to look at undergraduate research. We have some conversations, and we need to start looking at other types of funding to support this. We need to leverage perhaps the opportunity to work with community organizations, either industry or nonprofits, where they would be interested in collaborating and receive students. What we have learned is people who accept our students, they like them because they come somewhat prepared. So that sophomore year where they learn how to do research, when they end up in the lab, they'll break things, because we all break things. But they contribute, and it's a long-term investment too. So I think there are opportunities to work with other partners who are willing to, not just in the biomedical space, but other spaces. All right, thank you.
Two last logistical things. I realized that I forgot to introduce myself this morning. I am Vanelda Hopes, the Director of Academic Administration in the Office of Academic Affairs. My name has become synonymous with Winter Symposium breakfast. So I wanted to let you know that this morning this event was part of a pilot program. The Committee for Improving Student Food Security has a new program called PSU Food Share, where departments on campus who have events like this and have leftover food can then make it available to students on campus. So this morning we were the first department where after those doors closed, they sent out emails to students. And while we were in here this morning, we fed 62 students behind the doors. So we're really excited about that. If you are interested in that program, you can email foodhelp@psu.edu and get more information about that for your next event. Also, if you RSVP'd for the event today, you'll be receiving an email next week with the video from the event, as well as all of the slides. And they will also be available on the Office of Academic Affairs website if you want to find them there. So I'm going to invite Susan up to close out our event today.
A number of years ago, one of my very accomplished faculty colleagues at the University of Washington, who was coming up for promotion from associate to full professor, came to my office in tears and said, "Tell me how I withdraw my dossier. I don't want to go up for promotion anymore." And I said, "What happened?" And she said, "I ran into somebody on the promotion committee at the faculty club, and he said to me, 'You need to write a book.'" In her field, publishing articles was the standard. And she said, "Now I realize until I write a book, I'm never going to get promoted here. I just should quit. I should just stay an associate professor. And then she went on this long thing. And I said, "I was sitting in the room when that committee discussed your work, and what he meant to say to you was, you have so much amazing work, and it's all collected in these individual articles. Think of how powerful it'd be if it was in a book." But they were in the coat room, hanging coats and passing each other. And he said, "Oh, you should write a book." Thinking, I'm giving her praise. I'm telling her something great. I'm giving her positive feedback. And all she heard was, "You will never get promoted here." And she interpreted that and said, "I want to quit." Now, luckily, I could talk her out of it, and she knew me, and I could say, "No, that's not what he meant." This person went on, of course, not only to be promoted, but to become elected president of her national association and recognized with awards all over the place. At that moment, she was gonna quit because somebody thought he was saying something nice to her, and all she heard was, "You don't belong here." It happens that easily. Even to those of us who have PhDs and accomplishments and all sorts of things. If it happens that easily to people with those kinds of accomplishments, think of how it happens to our students who are the first person they know to walk onto a college campus. We've heard a lot about that today. There is a ton that we've learned from our speakers. I thank Dr. Fatui. I certainly thank Dr. Shortledge. I thank, gosh, Carlos, the work that you're doing in Exedo. We have folks that we can learn a lot from, but we have a lot that we have yet to do. Because we hear from our students in the Student Experience Project, our students often report that they feel like they have a pretty healthy growth mindset. And then we say to them, "Do you think your faculty share that?" And they go, "Nah, don't think so." So our students aren't perceiving that the faculty are bringing that attitude to the classroom. So we have a lot of work to do. We have some good opportunities to think about how to implement that work, fabulous examples. And I'd love to hear from all of you as you think about this over the next couple of weeks, how at the institution we can support you in trying out some of these ideas and implementing them. Are there small sources of funding? Are there resources that we could provide to make sure that you all can implement what you've heard? Because this is so powerfully important on behalf of our students. So I thank all of you for being here. I thank those of you who stayed till the very end of this. But this was a dynamic and fabulous conversation all day, and I'm just absolutely grateful that I'm part of a community where so many people want to have this conversation and want to open themselves up to learning from it and to be able to improve what we're doing on behalf of our students. So thank you again, very, very grateful, and I'm inspired to continue to move on with all of you as we continue to make PSU an institution that partners with our students as they seek their goals for success. So thank you all so much for being part of this today.